As a signatory to the Global Covenant of Mayors, Charlotte has joined thousands of cities and regions in a commitment to accelerate ambitious, measurable climate and energy initiatives.
Local communities across our nation are stepping up in unprecedented ways to respond to the ongoing challenges of our climate crisis.
We'll see what is the cost, what is the reliability, but without innovation, a lot of innovation, we won't be able to get there.
Give you a sense of the real-time action, the 10-year yield tumbling now 11 basis points, so continuing in this knee-jerk risk-off feel.
Their CPG history, their experience, and really how we might be able to combine together to really create this fantastic public company. And so we kind of got into the SPAC thing a little bit before it became such a hot method of going public.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance. Tom and Francine from London and New York. Tom, we were talking about some of the conundrums, some of the difficulties, of course, that governments will need to try to assess on how to keep the economy open as much as possible without, without making or keeping, whilst keeping, I guess, citizens safe. Still with us is Ian Shepherdson. He's at Pantheon Macroeconomics Chief Economist. Ian, is there anything that we can actually learn from China? I know it's a completely different economy. It's also a different way of, state intervention and how you keep people at home. But does COVID actually just show us that China has just dealt with this much better? And, what does that mean for the economy of the country?
Well, there's two things to say about China. First, I think, is that the loss of civil liberties that they imposed in order to squash the disease would be unacceptable in the West. If the fatality rate was 10 times higher, maybe. But with the fatality rate actually looking really quite low, I don't think there's any way that Western populations would accept the extent of the restrictions that China imposed. But the second thing is that what China did effectively, and still does, is track, trace, and quarantine. And that's a lesson that the US hasn't learned. It's a lesson that the UK said it had learned, but hadn't really learned. It's a lesson that Germany and Italy have learned, which is why their cases are now broadly flat, whereas in some other European countries, including the UK, cases are rocketing. So I certainly wouldn't suggest that we would absorb lock, stock and barrel what China did. I don't think we could or we should. But I really wish that the US and the UK had learned the lesson about track, trace and quarantine and actually done it. And we wouldn't be in anything like as big a hole as we are now if that lesson had been learned. And if the federal government in the US had been much more willing to coordinate what states were doing, rather than leaving them to fight it out between themselves, which I think it was disastrous.
Ian, on China, China's also threatened to kill this TikTok deal over, what they call dirty Trump tactics. Do we reset the relationship between the U.S. and China after the U.S. election, depending on who's president, or no matter who gets in the White House, it's going to be fraught with tension?
Yeah, I think there's a widespread recognition in the U.S. now that China is not America's friend. It's not a friend of the West. It's a long-term strategic foe, if you like. Doesn't mean a shooting war, but it does mean that we need to be keeping them at arm's length. And I think the idea of resetting to where we were before Trump and before the trade war simply isn't going to happen. The next administration, I think, even under Biden, which is what I would expect, will still have to deal with a very troublesome situation in China. But I think the emphasis will change from punitive tariffs, which mostly are being paid by Americans, and ridiculously over-the-top rhetoric that we get from Trump, into something quieter, but I would hope more effective, because the trade war isn't achieving the objectives that Trump wanted. I mean, I think he has correctly highlighted that we shouldn't be inviting Chinese businesses into our critical national infrastructure. I've always thought that was crazy. But equally, we do have to trade with them, and we need to trade with them on terms that are advantageous to both, otherwise that trade won't happen. And simply putting up tariff barriers that American consumers end up paying is not the way to change how we trade with China. And I would like to think that a Biden administration would take a more sensible and more constructive approach there.
Ian Shepherdson, thank you so much from England today. Greatly appreciate it with Pantheon Economics. Let me tell you about the Bloomberg Equity Summit. This is a wonderful summit with some important speakers, timely speakers, really across all of business, education, and sports as well. A number of names there familiar, to say the least, and of course, most importantly, the former Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton. This is Bloomberg. Good morning.
The Boston Symphony Orchestra presents BSO at Home. While you stay inside, enjoy a curated collection of archived concerts and behind-the-scenes stories from BSO musicians. BSO Homeschool provides lessons for music lovers of all ages. New performances and messages from musicians are added regularly. Enjoy these selections and much more at bso.org/at-home.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance. I'm Ritika Gupta with your Bloomberg Business Flash. Tesla is setting the lofty goal of making a $25,000 car by 2023. The cheaper car will be possible by innovating electric car batteries and cutting the costs in half. The news came as part of the company's so-called Battery Day, but it lacked the sizzle investors have come to expect with CEO Elon Musk. HSBC is joining Goldman Sachs in pausing its efforts to return to its UK office. That's after the government appealed to Britons to work from home to help combat coronavirus. The bank says critical workers supporting customers in branches will continue to do so, but that most staff will remain at home. JP Morgan Chase is moving about $230 billion from the UK to Frankfurt ahead of Brexit. The shift will make it one of the largest banks in Germany. With less than 4 months to go until the Brexit transition period expires, international banks have been beefing up operations in the European Union in case UK-based firms aren't able to retain passporting rights in a trade deal. And Amazon is telling Echelon Fitness to stop selling the Prime bike, an exercise bike promoted as a collaboration with the company. The e-commerce giant says it's not an Amazon product or related to Amazon Prime, and that they're working with Echelon to clarify and change the product branding. No comment yet from Echelon. That is your latest Bloomberg Business Flash. Francine, Tom.
Thank you so much, Ritika. Now, European stocks are actually on the up, but we're seeing the same for futures in the U.S. A lot of the focus is on some of the valuations that we saw there. Gold actually slipping below $1,900 an ounce. And if you look at here in Europe, gains in airlines, media, and auto shares have been pushing the Stocks Europe 600 towards its strongest increase in 2 weeks. This is partly, I guess, a belief in some European market participants that if we have extra restrictions, then it will also follow with extra support from the government. The treasuries are pretty much steady, and then sterling, Tom, always look at sterling because it's dropped to a 2-month low after there's worry that there's a second British lockdown, because at the moment we've been told it cannot be ruled out.
In general, the tape better than it was 2 hours ago. We want to make clear on that. Futures up 15 as well. I do want to point out, I haven't mentioned it yet today, but of course on the Turkish watch, it's really quite important. 740 through 750. We blew through 7.60, and this morning we continue that move with what's called log convexity up to 7.68. This is a decidedly an accelerating weaker Turkish lira, and that's something to watch here, away from the stronger dollar story, but nevertheless of interest, particularly to Europe. Coming up on Bloomberg Radio, the 10 o'clock hour, the one I've been wanting to really listen to, the author of Scorpions, Noah Feldman of Harvard Law. This is Bloomberg.
Some things you see coming, some things you don't. The trick is to be ready for anything. Pablo from Infrastructure Support is working every day to keep essential market data flowing seamlessly. We keep on, so you can keep on.
Well, it's really a reminder, isn't it, just how sensitive the markets are to any commentary about trade. We did see some pressure on the yuan, we did see some pressure on the futures. That is now being reversed.
Bloomberg Surveillance, I'm Rishika Gupta with the Bloomberg First Word News. Pressure is rising on UK Chancellor Rishi Sunak to set out how the government intends to protect jobs and businesses through the autumn and winter. The Treasury has spent over £100 billion on wage subsidies and business loans, but this is due to end in the next few weeks. Sunak has previously warned the current level of support is not sustainable. Fed Chairman Jerome Powell is calling for further support for the U.S. economy, saying it has a long way to go before fully recovering from the pandemic. He made the comments during testimony to the House Financial Services Committee. Prospects for another round of fiscal stimulus have dimmed in recent days amid tensions over a replacement for Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Presidents Donald Trump and Xi Jinping clashed during a virtual United Nations General Assembly meeting. The U.S. president used his speech to accuse Beijing of polluting the oceans and lying to the world about coronavirus. His Chinese counterpart hit back, slamming leaders who try to politicize the virus. Global news 24 hours a day on air and at Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Rishika Gupta. This is Bloomberg. Francine, Tom.
Rishika Gupta, thank you so much. Greatly appreciate it. There is so much to talk to our Kevin Cirilli about, our chief Washington correspondent. But this morning, Washington will pause. The law clerks of Ruth Bader Ginsburg will be pallbearers for the justice as Washington pays honor. Kevin, what do you look for at the Capitol and then on the steps of the Supreme Court?
You know, I was thinking about this just the other day when Labor Secretary Eugene Scalia took out an op-ed in the Washington Post, and he, of course, is the son of Supreme Court Justice Scalia, and he wrote about their friendship and how it really went beyond just the Supreme Court cases of the day, the cases that have decided really modern life in America. And I thought it was a remarkable illustration on behalf of the Labor Secretary, Tom, that yes, even in a time when so many are questioning the institutions of our country, and to some extent rightfully so, that still two polar opposites in Justice Scalia and Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg can still not just find common ground, but have a friendship.
Kevin, I went back last night and looked at Ronald Reagan introducing Sandra Day O'Connor from years and years ago. I believe it was 1981, and it seems like a time from another place. Can you in any way frame the greeting that the Judiciary Committee will give whomever the next justice is?
It's going to be very tense, you know, and I've been talking to sources who are going to be ushering through the confirmation process for whomever President Trump picks, and he has said that he's going to make that announcement sometime on Saturday. And to be quite frank with you, yesterday, Senator Mitt Romney, the Republican from Utah, saying that he would be able to get on board with having a vote, that essentially just gave the green light for a Supreme Court justice nomination to be confirmed by the Senate, if not before November 3rd, shortly thereafter. So the math is on the Republicans in the Senate side.
Kevin, I mean, I have a couple of questions on, you know, Mitt Romney seems pretty critical in this, and he said he now supported. So does that make the difference with him behind it?
Yes.
You know, is it, I mean, it's never a done deal, but it makes it much more likely that it would be confirmed.
Yes, and Francine, I put this question to even some Democrats yesterday, and they said, what else can they do? What can the Democrats do? What can Speaker Pelosi do in order to stop this? There's not much. I mean, just simply because of the process, there's really not much that Democrats can do to stop this at all. So there likely will be a very contentious battle, but even the confirmation hearings that are going to be going on, it's going to be coinciding with the presidential election.
Yes, does that change the polls? If you look at, you know, change or influence the polls, I know we've been trying to, you know, figure it out with you, Kevin, if it does at some point. There's also news on the Chinese front between the U.S. and China and what's happened at the UN General Assembly. Like, you know, what influences voters more?
You know, I went back and I'll get to China in a second. I went back and looked at the polls during the contentious Brett Kavanaugh hearing, and the expectation was at the time, the general thinking was that this was going to hurt Republicans, and it had the reverse effect. it had the reverse effect, and everyone was scratching their heads and they couldn't figure out why. But that's where a Supreme Court justice pick really can influence the polls and the dynamics here, because Republicans were, for whatever reason, very motivated after Justice Kavanaugh was confirmed to the Supreme Court. But on the issue of China, yesterday at the UN General Assembly, President Trump, in pre-recorded remarks, really pushing some blame to China in a very forward sense. And so while whether it's on Iran and snapback sanctions, and where the U.S. would like to see Europe do more, quietly behind the scenes, there's this growing feeling that the Europeans are going to start coming on board with China, even if there's a different president in a couple of months, that the Europeans and the U.S. are going to embolden their allyship in dealing with President Xi.
Kevin, you know we've got a great legal team, and thrilled that Noah Feldman will join Bloomberg Radio here in the 10 o'clock hour. I want to bring up that board again of the 8 justices that we have now. Kevin, I want you to talk about the political reality of Justice Roberts, Chief Justice Roberts, not over on the right side with the Republicans, but in the middle. And do you, within the politics of Kevin Cirilli and your study of it, suggest that there can be a new neutral a la Anthony Kennedy? I mean, how does that work?
Brilliant, Tom. You know, brilliant, because I think what you just said, the new neutral, that's a phrase that we should use every single day when we talk to the Noah Feldmans of the world, when we talk to the Supreme Court analysts of the world, because the new neutral is really going to be the deciding case, not just on abortion rights, not just on gay marriage, but also as it relates to the Affordable Care Act. And I think that really is going to be the point that I'm going to hammer home, because that, when you look at exit polls from 2016, was one of the top issues that President Trump's supporters voted on. And so people like Justice Roberts, when there is that Obamacare court case that is likely going to come up, if not in the next couple of weeks, definitely in the next couple of months, they're going to be the key voice on that, especially at a time when the middle class is hurting, when the middle class doesn't necessarily have a job, and the middle class is in need of health care. And so the new neutral is I would argue, a recalibration in the similar way that President Trump reorganized the Republican Party on issues to some extent pertaining to health care, and to definite extent pertaining to trade policies as well, which, oh yeah, the Supreme Court has some court cases to deal with on international trade relations as well, and how it relates to domestic companies.
Kevin, thank you so much for the update. Smart, as always. Our Kevin Cirilli, their chief Washington correspondent. Now, we're just getting some breaking news out of Ant Group. This is a huge company, of course, that we follow very closely. We understand through our own reporting and sources on the ground that Ant is said to seek $17.5 billion in the Hong Kong portion of the IPO. There was a number of questions about whether it, where it would IPO, also given the U.S.-China trade tension. So we'll have a lot more on this developing story. Coming up next, we track COVID-19 with Lauren Sauer, Johns Hopkins Assistant Professor of Emergency Medicine. This is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Best, your weekly review of the most important business news, analysis, and interviews from Bloomberg Television around the world.
Ken Burns, welcome to Bloomberg Big Decisions.
We have always been a mixture of things. We are always stronger for that mixture.
Growth is a way to stay competitive, delight more and more consumers.
Welcome to the Best of Bloomberg Technology. I'm Emily Chang.
They've moved the needle by acknowledging that they have to monitor the content.
What is one word of advice you'll take with you?
Learn how to listen
and that is certainly something that has served me well.
Ankiti, where do you go from here? It's a huge market, it's a huge opportunity. I want to go 100x from here.
Our philosophy is to partner where we can and stand apart when we should.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance. As always, Tom and Francine from London and New York. Tom, we continue to track the virus. Bloomberg has developed a unique partnership with the leading authority on COVID-19. Johns Hopkins has been at the forefront of the international response, and every day we bring insight from experts in public health, infectious disease, and emergency preparedness. Well, joining us today is Lauren Sauer, Johns Hopkins University Assistant Professor of Emergency Medicine. Lauren, thank you for joining us. It's a pretty grim landmark. We've had over 200,000 deaths in the U.S. What are we not doing for this to stop or at least reduce the numbers?
I think, we're all very cognizant of the fact that we've just crossed this threshold of 200,000 deaths. And there are a couple of things that we need to really sort of regroup and refocus on. And one is a national strategy. And that strategy should really focus on testing broadly, a testing strategy that reaches all across the United States, and how we distribute tests and how we analyze data that looks the same when it's coming from each place. We need to go back to basics on that social distancing approach as we wait for a vaccine and as we wait for other therapeutics to come on board. That social distancing we're seeing not happening in a lot of places still across the country. And we really need to focus on the fundamentals of keeping people healthy and out of the hospital as we approach flu season as well.
Lauren, the landscape changed yesterday. The Prime Minister of the United Kingdom shoved in our faces out 6 months to March of next year. Is the medical community doing the same thing? You people have been out front on this from day one. Are you people framing a pandemic out to March of next year?
I think, frankly, that there's no way around it that we're going to see COVID-19 through the middle of next year. What those numbers look like really depends on our behavior over the next few months and the development of the vaccines. And so I think I've said even here that I don't expect to see a vaccine that's widely distributable before the beginning of the next year. And while a lot of progress is being made, I think that that timeline aligns with what we're hearing from the UK.
I want to review right now the slope of the case growth and the death growth. In the United Kingdom, or it can be in America, there are two different vectors. I get that. But the fact of the matter is people are really, really focusing on the cases dynamic. Should we do that, or should we focus on the death dynamic?
I think you have to focus on both in slightly different ways. And the case dynamics really tells you a lot about people's behavior. And so the death rate is absolutely critically important. But cases, especially in places where we're not protecting, cohorting, sequestering vulnerable populations, is equally as important. And we have to focus on how that transmission dynamic is happening, how that spread is happening throughout an entire population.
Lauren, you see, there was a lot of debate here in Europe that for example, the French authorities and the Italian authorities are much more heavy-handed in, giving guidance or giving rules and then enforcing them through police, something that the UK doesn't really want to do. So they give guidance and say, right, we'll shut the pubs, but there's no one really to enforce it. And the Prime Minister was saying this is a problem of liberty. The US has also similar dynamics. I mean, is the only way to get this right to make sure that people enforce it, or is that going a step too far?
I think enforcement is very important. Personal liberties are obviously absolutely fundamental to this country, and the way we sort of conduct our daily business. That being said, we have to make a space in which we, as a broad population, as a broad community, come together to do the right thing in order to do things like get our kids back in schools, get the hospitals open and safe, protect our healthcare workers. And so if enforcement is a step that allows us to make sure that these public health measures are being used appropriately and applied broadly, then I think it is a step that we need to take. I'm not saying that I think we need, you know, full-fledged lockdowns across the country or in the UK, but I think the rules are put in place and then have to be enforced. Otherwise, they're not rules. They are just guidance.
Lauren, we're just getting some breaking news. Johnson & Johnson beginning this testing a one-dose COVID shot in 6,000 patients. Does it make a difference if it's a one-dose vaccine or two-dose vaccine to the number of people that will have it and you know, the effectiveness of it?
There's real value in having a one-dose vaccine. I think a two-dose vaccine with that second booster shot is something that we're used to, particularly in childhood immunizations. But a one-dose vaccine makes it easier to ensure that more people get it. We don't have to worry about follow-up in patients, which is great because it allows a one-time visit, and then you don't have to track and make sure people are following up with that second visit. The logistics of distributing and giving out a one-dose vaccine is much more simple than a two-dose vaccine, for sure. So there's real utility in that.
Lauren, do we also underestimate, and a number of people have actually been writing in to, you know, make sure that we cover this, are we underestimating the impact that the number of infections have on hospitals, on the way they work, and also on the way that, you know, that they, deal with procedures and surgeries important in the future that are non-COVID related?
Yeah, so this is something that hospitals are focusing on right now, and it's been a real challenge. So how do you make a safe space for patients who need their regular medical care or elective procedures or minor surgeries or even major surgeries while COVID is going on? So in the beginning of the pandemic here in the US, a lot of hospitals canceled elective procedures, canceled a lot of routine visits, and that set a lot of people's medical care back. So for example, we're seeing patients coming in later for things that they would have otherwise already been in the hospital for. So cancer visits, surgeries, things like that. And that means that their medical care is going to be more complex, which means a more challenging healthcare procedure environment. And so that affects the patient, that affects the other patients in the hospital, and that affects the healthcare workers as well. So it's something we really need to focus on, getting that capacity of non-COVID care back up in the United States and actually globally.
Lauren, thank you so much. As always, Lauren Sauer there of Johns Hopkins, and be sure to check out VRUS Go on the Bloomberg terminal for the latest information. You can also tune in every day for our exclusive conversations with Johns Hopkins experts for an inside look at battling COVID-19. Now, coming up next, we speak with Carl Bildt, the former Prime Minister of Sweden. We'll talk about foreign affairs, and we'll talk about Belarus. This is Bloomberg. explore the trends, investments, and competition of the European ETF industry. Join us on Bloomberg ETF IQ Europe.
We will spare no effort in developing vaccines, treatments, new forms of mass testing. But unless we palpably make progress, we should assume that the restrictions I have announced will remain in place for perhaps 6 months.
Well, the Prime Minister Boris Johnson, there are new COVID-19 restrictions in the UK. Now, for more analysis on Europe's coronavirus measures, we're joined by Carl Bildt. He's former Prime Minister of Sweden. Sweden, of course, widely criticized and applauded at the same time throughout the pandemic for their soft approach to lockdown. Mr. Bildt, thank you for joining Bloomberg Surveillance. How difficult is it, actually, as a politician, as a head of state right now, to know what to do? What's the right thing?
Well, I think it was more difficult in the beginning of the crisis because at that time we knew very little. We had to rely on sort of previous experience, and most European countries didn't have much of experience. I mean, the East Asians did significantly better because they learned more from the SARS. I think we are now in a situation where we unfortunately have learned quite a lot during this particular year. So difficult for government, no question about that, but not as difficult as it was 6 months ago.
Okay, but I guess what is the most difficult decision? So part of it is, you know, you need to make sure that the health services are protected, that they can cope. So you reduce the number of infections whilst keeping as much as possible the economy open. But what about whether police have to enforce the rules in the first place?
Well, hopefully, you will have a situation where most people would see the necessity of actually adjusting your way of life, of having masks and not having mass meetings and not doing the stupid things that particularly young people have a tendency to do anyhow. I don't think we will have any of our countries would have the police forces that would be able to patrol everything in a single corner of the country. So it has to rely quite a lot on the responsible behavior of the citizens. At the extreme, of course, you need the police to go in and close down a restaurant or something like that, or a pub or whatever, if they're doing things that are clearly not supposed to happen. But the adjustment of social behavior is something that we will all have to live with for quite some time, I fear.
Until we get a vaccine, how hopeful are you that we do get a vaccine and that it's a vaccine that will be accepted by citizens to take?
I don't know. But when I listen to those people who know these things are saying, they are fairly optimistic. But even so, it's going to take quite some time for the vaccine to have a sufficient impact upon all of society. So we are talking about a situation like this that is going to stretch well into next year, well into, I would say, the first half of next year. I doubt if that is going to be substantially different from what we have today.
Mr. Bildt, how should the West deal with Russia, given what's happened with Mr. Navalny?
Well, we have Mr. Navalny, the attempted murder of him, which I think is a sign of how sort of fragile the political situation is in Russia, that they felt the necessity to try to murder him. And then, of course, when it's all sort of exposed by the Germans and by laboratories also in France and Sweden, has to be said. I mean, the counter propaganda, the lies, is really sort of beyond the pale. But we had, or the Germans had to be precise, they had a hacking of their parliament by the Russians. They had a murder of a dissident, a Chechen dissident, right in the center of Berlin, just not that long ago. So we clearly have a Russian behavior that requires firmness from the Western side, firmness in every single respect, that they can't get away with these things.
Mr. Bildt, unless the West deals with the pandemic with success, can Western countries afford to be tough on Russia? Can they afford to be tough on China?
Well, why shouldn't we afford to be? I mean, China is a significant economic actor, no question about that. It's a big global economy. We have a trade dependence with them. With Russia, it's not a very significant economy. Our interaction in terms of economy with Russia is very limited. I mean, there's an element of natural gas, But we see also the dependence on natural gas and dependence on fossil fuels going down. And even the short-term demand for gas is, of course, down quite considerably. So I don't see any sort of downsides on that.
All right, Mr. Bildt, thank you so much. Carl Bildt there, the former Prime Minister of Sweden. Too short a time, so we'll get him back on really soon. This is what the markets are doing. European stocks seem to be higher again with U.S. futures. A lot of the focus, of course, is towards this upward momentum after the September sell-off. Cut valuations, gold slipping below $1,900 an ounce. I'm seeing gains in media, auto shares, but auto airlines here in Europe. The other thing we're watching out for is, of course, dollar. Treasuries steady, dollar steady before the Federal Reserve Chairman Jay Powell and other policymakers speak a little bit later in Washington. Coming up next, more Bloomberg surveillance. This is Bloomberg.
Ada 3 kelompok pengungsi tersebut yang sudah berpencar arah. Kemudian kami dari Polsek Banda Sakti berkoordinasi dengan perangkat desa Kampung Jomblang melakukan upaya pengumpulan secara persuasif serta minta tolong kepada warga. Alhamdulillah warga yang terpecah semuanya berkumpul.
When everything around us, including the way we work and live, has been interrupted, uninterrupted service is peace of mind. Kimmy from customer support is responding to a 500% increase in daily call volume, no matter what. We keep on, so you can keep on.
I think what we've seen during this period of time is that communicating via video is not a fad. We are using it in all aspects of our lives, for work, for learning, for communicating, for staying in touch.
I'm not going to say that there's a bubble forming. I'm going to say that there is potential for one to form.
A market which has ignored all incoming bad news.
What bothers me is that we still are going into this weakness with so many people still unemployed.
The room for policy maneuver is very, very limited.
Monetary policy, the way we grew up with it, it doesn't work anymore.
Monetary policy will do its part. It's not, though, the primary driver of this recovery right now.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance with Tom Keene, Jonathan Farrow, and Lisa Abramowitz.
From New York and London, for our audience worldwide, good morning, good morning. This is Bloomberg Surveillance live on Bloomberg TV and radio. Alongside Tom Keene and Lisa Abramowitz, I'm Jonathan Ferro, counting you down to the opening bow with equity futures positive 0.5%, and I have absolutely no idea why we have a rally in Europe either. Tom, one thing I do know is that in 1 hour time, we will be catching up with the Vice Chair of the Federal Reserve.
Well, to me, it's the interview of the quarter, if not the year. This speech he gave August 31st was exceptionally important, John. I spoke to the Vice Chairman yesterday, and he's really enthused about expanding on a lot of this monetary mumbo-jumbo. Warning, it's going to be a little technical up front. But, John, it's an important speech. But the backdrop, John, and you nailed this weeks ago, is this massive case buildup in the United Kingdom that the Prime Minister talked about yesterday. I'm sorry, John, the landscape changed yesterday when he went out to March of 2021.
And the outlook for Europe gets a little bit worse, and the data this morning on the services side backing up that view. Manufacturing still doing okay. From my perspective for the Federal Reserve, Tom, I think it's really simple. The message they want to send, if things get better, we won't do anything. What I'm trying to understand is what happens if things get worse.
Yeah, well said.
They're at the zero lower bound.
Yeah.
They're forecasting they'll be there for a long time. One thing they haven't given us any clarity on is what they do around QE.
How many times did they mention fiscal yesterday, Powell and Mnuchin? I mean, I know Lisa was keeping count of it, John, but, you know, I mean, how many times did they mention it?
I lost count. Lisa, were you counting?
No, but I'm going to let Tom nail that later this morning because he likes to nail things down.
47 times.
47. There you go, right there. 47 times you mentioned fiscal stimulus.
Can I just to clear this up?
Yes, please,
just to clear this up.
Go ahead.
For our listeners, our audience worldwide, Tom Keene has not counted how many times. Now, maybe he found out that it was 47 times. I just want to clarify, just in case someone puts that in a research note, that it was mentioned 47 times. I'm sure Tom Keene wasn't even watching that testimony yesterday.
Look, I think that the key is here the fact that Jay Powell keeps saying we need fiscal support, we need fiscal support, when we don't know how much the momentum is going to decline as virus cases increase, as the fiscal stimulus currently in effect gets worn off, really highlights where the balance of risks are. And in an hour's time, that seems to be the major pivotal point in the new framework for the Federal Reserve. Vice Chair Rich Clarida joining Bloomberg Surveillance, 8 a.m. You do not want to miss it, talking about why inflation may not increase as much this cycle and how the Fed is going to shift its policy around that. 9:45 a.m. John, you talked about the disappointment over in Europe with manufacturing and just the general activity levels. We'll get a similar read for September in the United States, manufacturing and services PMIs. And 10 a.m., Fed Chair Jay Powell going back to Congress with his hands out, saying, you guys have to act. They won't act. Then we'll hear what he has potentially to do about it on the back end. We don't get a fiscal package before the election, John.
I think we're all excited for round two of this, aren't we? Let's get to the price action. Equity futures positive on the S&P 500 this morning, up 16. On the S&P, we advanced around about 0.5%. A real lift in the European equity market as well. Services bad, manufacturing good. That's the read on the PMI this morning. Euro-dollar 117, pretty much dead flat. And get me a Red Bull, Tom Keene. The Treasury market, a total snooze. 0.67%. On a 10-year. It's where we've closed basically every week for the last 4.
The real yields come in, John. We were -1, -1.01. We're now -0.95. So I guess that's a glimmer of vol in the bond market. But you're right. All of this is secondary to that quiet in the bond market, including stronger dollar. DXY 94 flat right now. And, you know, it is the major currencies. But even the Bloomberg dollar index comes stronger as well. So you're right. It's everything's moving except bonds.
Quiet in treasuries, volatility in equities. Let's bring in Victoria Fernandez, shall we? Crossmark Global Investments Chief Market Strategist. She joins us right now. Victoria, great to catch up with you, as always. Walk me through that. You've identified the same thing, the volatility. What's behind the pickup in vol that we're seeing right now in equities?
Yeah, John, I mean, it goes to what you guys were saying. There's volatility in the markets, but we think the underlying fundamentals are still strong. So the volatility, we see it in the futures really going around the election time, those October futures, which encompasses November 3rd. We've seen a lot of movement there. So obviously, increased of COVID cases in the UK and in Europe is going to be driving that. We've talked before about how the volatility in the market is really driven by COVID more than anything else. Talks of vaccine. We had Pfizer out yesterday yesterday talking about their vaccine trials. J&J made their announcement this morning about their phase 3 trial that they're doing. And obviously you tie in with some of that, the fact that now you have a Supreme Court issue, and is that going to push some of the stimulus that you guys were talking about further down the road? And that leads to, again, increased volatility, although underlying economic fundamentals seem to be trending okay.
Victoria, I want to congratulate you on your research note that you talk about a barbell strategy where you're talking about holding on to the high-flying techs and adding to it as well. Why are so few people talking about that?
You know, it seems that a lot of investors tend to want to go all in on a sector, and they really find themselves chasing the market and chasing those headlines. That's a very dangerous position to be in. We like to take that longer term perspective. And so if you do that, you have to say, look, longer term, yes, these names have really moved up. We've seen that with the high-flying tech names that you mentioned. But we think there's still more runway for them, not just because of COVID, but because of the way things have changed on a permanent basis. We know people are going to go back to work, but you're still going to need more broadband. You're going to need more data infrastructure. There's things that people are doing like telemedicine that are going to continue. So keep some of those names there. But we all are looking at the recovery process. We are looking at some of those staple names, some cyclical names that you should have in your portfolio to increase your exposure across the board. For a longer term investor, a barbell strategy is what keeps your portfolio from being too volatile.
A lot of investors, Victoria, come on this program, reassert their confidence in an ongoing rally over the longer term in equities. And they cite the credit markets as being well behaved as a reason for that confidence. You yourself mentioned that in a recent note. And yet we have seen a number of pretty big outflows from the largest high yield bond ETF of late. We're starting to see credit spreads creep up just a little bit. At what point do you start to pay attention?
Well, I think you have to constantly pay attention to that credit market. I mean, you guys were talking about how the 10-year Treasury has been closing at 66, 67 basis points continuously. And if you look at the technicals on the Treasury market, you've got that triangle forming, and it seems kind of like a coil that's starting to wind up. And I'm not sure whether we're going to see rates shoot higher or shoot lower, but I think we're getting to a point where we're going to see some movement. Then we'll see credit markets move as well. But you have to watch and see, especially with earnings coming up next month, what we think we're going to see from these companies. Are they going to report some strong balance sheets like we saw out of Nike last night? If so, then maybe you see a little more strength in that credit market as some of the fear starts to come back.
The numbers from Nike absolutely phenomenal, and the commentary as well. We can thrive in this environment. Victoria, how difficult is it to find the winners that other people haven't already identified?
Bloomberg Equality Summit possible. Before we get started, we have a few housekeeping announcements to ensure you can all enjoy the program. For today's event, we have partnered with Thyssen, an audio-to-text platform that is transcribing today's discussions in real time, making the event more accessible. You can access Thyssen for the real-time transcription via the link in the session description. If you experience any issues with audio or video quality while viewing, try to refresh your browser, or you can use the chat box in the bottom right. Refresh your browser, or you can use the chat box in the bottom right corner of your screen for support. Please engage with us on social media using the hashtag Bloomberg Equality. All right, let's get started. Here's David Rubenstein with Dr. Anthony Fauci.
Hello, I'm David Rubenstein, and I'm here at the Bloomberg Equality Summit with Dr. Tony Fauci from the NIH. Dr. Fauci, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you, David. It's always a pleasure to be with you.
So I want to just ask a couple upfront questions about the coronavirus situation, then we'll get into some equality issues if we can. So today, the Department of Health and Human Services says that its plan is to have everybody vaccinated by the end of the first quarter of 2021. In your view, is that realistic?
You know, that is possible, David, but to get everyone vaccinated, I think logistically, that is going to be tough. I mean, there will be tens of millions of doses available by the end of the year and in the first quarter. As you get to the end of the first quarter, there'll be hundreds of millions of doses. Whether or not you can get injection into everyone, and remember, it depends on what the vaccine is. If it's the Moderna vaccine, it's a prime followed by a boost 28 days later. So I think we need to be careful. It will be aspirational to do that, David, but I think it's more towards the middle to the end of the year that you could get people vaccinated.
And are you reasonably confident that by the end of this year, this calendar year, one, two, or three vaccines will have been approved by the FDA?
Well, yeah, will have been made available in the sense of either by the formal approval or by an emergency use authorization. But to repeat your question with a firm answer, by the end of 2020, namely November or December, I feel reasonably confident that there will be one or more vaccines that will be begun to be being made available to the American public.
And do you believe that the process for approving the vaccines has been politicized such that Americans might be nervous about whether they have been approved too soon?
Well, none have been approved yet, David. There is certainly a lot of talk and concern about politicization of the process of approval. But as I always point out to people, there are so many levels of checkpoints to mitigate against political interference with that. I think one of the most important is that there is a data and safety monitoring board, which is an independent board, not beholden to the government, to the FDA, or to the companies, that analyze the data and talk about safety and whether or not it's deemed to be effective. At that point, those data, David, will ultimately become public. So if there is a chance, which I do not think will happen, about an end run to pressure premature approval, I think that will become readily apparent and transparent to people, because there are a number of checkpoints. The Data and Safety Monitoring Board, there are advisory committees to the FDA, and the FDA has pledged publicly in multiple editorials that they will not let any political considerations get involved in their decision to make the vaccine available. So I am going to take them for their word.
Okay, so is the coronavirus White House task force still meeting regularly? Are you still part of that?
Yes, I am, David. Our last meeting was yesterday. We had a meeting at the White House in the Situation Room. We are not meeting as frequently as we used to, because remember, back in the late winter, early spring, we were meeting essentially 7 days a week. Right now, we're meeting probably 1 or 2 days a week.
Hey, you have been quoted recently as saying that you thought maybe we can get back to normality in terms of living our lives the way we did a year or two ago by the end of 2021. Is that still your view?
It is, David. I think it's going to be a combination, and this relates to the question you asked me a moment ago, that if we can deploy and get vaccines distributed throughout the country by the end of 2021, and we combine that with a continuation of a certain level of the public health measures, I believe we can approach and perhaps, reach a degree of more of normality that closely resembles.
So you've become popular because you've been willing to say what you really believe. Have you ever thought during this whole process that it just wasn't worth the effort, and you've never thought about quitting and just saying, I'm going home and do something else? Is that correct?
Well, that is absolutely correct, David. This is such an important issue. I mean, I'm a physician, a scientist, and a public health person. This is what I do. I mean, this is my career. I mean, the idea about walking away in any way from the most important and impactful outbreak in 102 years, I mean, since the 1918 pandemic, no matter what the stress or strain is, the thought has never entered my mind to abandon this or walk away from it. It's just too much of a challenge, not only to the United States, but to the entire world.
Now, you've headed the Division of Infectious Diseases at the NIH since 1984. So is this the biggest challenge you've ever seen for in your career?
You know, David, if you're talking about the impact in a concentrated period of time and the potential implications for the entire population of the world, the answer to that would be yes. I think you always have to ask about HIV/AIDS, which already we know now, has killed, tens of millions of people and continues to infect people throughout the world at a very high rate. That has been over a period now since 1981, 39 years. But when you talk about the concentrated explosion of a pandemic that essentially can involve virtually anybody and everybody on the planet, the answer to your question, yes, this is the most difficult thing that we have faced in a very constrained period of time.
Now, one of the challenges you personally faced was you had a polyp on your throat and couldn't talk for a while. And that surgery has been done. Is your throat okay now?
Yeah, it's back to normal. In fact, there are some people who've even texted in saying, is that really Dr. Fauci? It certainly doesn't sound like him. This is my normal voice, but the very scratchy voice that we had even on some interviews that I had with you, hopefully is gone forever.
Good. So let's go to some equality issues. There's been concern that as the virus has moved forward, the people who have been most adversely affected are often minorities. African Americans, for example, in a higher percentage than whites are being affected by COVID-19. Why is that, and why have they died at a higher percentage than whites have?
That's a good question, David, and the answer is really quite disturbing. There's almost a double whammy on the minority populations. First, on the basis of the jobs that they as a broad group hold, put them out in contact on the front line with people and don't allow them, in many respects, for most of them, to be able to do the kinds of things that you and I are doing now through a computer in a safe way. So the nature of their jobs put them at a higher risk of getting infected in the first place. So they automatically start off at a disadvantage. Then when they do get infected, they have a much higher rate of hospitalizations per 100,000 than the population in general, and certainly the white population. And the reason for that, David, relates back to the decades and decades old social determinants of health. They have a much higher incidence and prevalence of diabetes, hypertension, obesity, chronic kidney disease, chronic lung disease, so that the very underlying comorbidities that predispose you to a serious outcome, such as hospitalization and death, are clearly much more prevalent in the minority populations.
So let me ask you about a concern that has been expressed by an op-ed recently in the New York Times about whether people who are minorities are being adequately represented in the COVID-19 phase 3 trials. What can you say about that?
Well, we are trying as best as we possibly can to get equitable representation of African Americans, Latinx, and other minorities. We're doing better with the Latinx, but still we have to do much, much better with the relative percentage of African Americans that are in the trial. It's a good reason for that, David, because when the trials ultimately get shown to be safe and effective with regard to the candidate vaccines, we want to be able to say with confidence that they are safe and effective in all demographic groups. You can make an assumption that they are, but we want to prove it by getting the equitable representation in the actual phase 3 trial itself.
Now, there's a concern in the minority community, I believe, that when the vaccine is available, wealthy white people will get it first, and then it will trickle down, and the last people to get it will be minorities who might need it better or more than wealthy white people. What can you do to assure people that people of minority backgrounds will be getting this in the same fair way that it should be distributed?
Well, there will be a prioritization. I mean, classically, notwithstanding COVID-19, whenever there is a shortage of vaccine in the sense of when you're rolling it out and you don't have all the doses. Classically, the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices advises the CDC, who makes that determination about what prioritization is going to be done. We're complementing that with another group from the National Academy of Medicine, which has recently met to also give a recommendation. We don't know exactly what the decision is going to be, but I can tell you, David, from past experience, clearly people who can benefit from the vaccine the most and those who are at the highest risk of serious complications will be in the higher priority. Almost certainly, the first priority will be the frontline workers, the people such as the healthcare providers who put themselves at risk. But close behind them will very likely be people who could benefit the most, and almost certainly that would include minorities.
Well, but minorities very often might be in the lower income strata. Suppose they say, yes, thank you for putting me at the front of the line, but I can't afford to get the vaccine. What are we going to do as the U.S. government to make certain that people that can't really afford it will get it?
Yeah, well, you know, that was a very important question, David, and we were at the task force meeting and said, when we got asked that question, will the government make sure that that is not the case, that people who cannot afford it, as it were. First of all, people need to understand the vaccine itself is free. The federal government has pre-purchased those. So the vaccine itself is free. If there's any fee, it's going to be associated with the administrative aspects of administering the vaccine. And that should not be something that gets in the way of poor people receiving it.
In the medical profession, I would say it's relatively not as represented as the population of minorities. Is there anything that's happened in the NIH to make certain that more people who are minority backgrounds work at the NIH or get trained to be medical doctors?
Yeah, we're doing a lot of things, David, to try and right that inequity that is still there. We're doing much better now than we were doing a few years ago, but as an organization, and particularly the NIH director, Francis Collins, and all of the Institute directors, including myself, are very seriously involved in doing whatever we can at every level, the entry level of fellows, people who are getting tenured, such as lab chiefs, and even senior people who are at the leadership level. Obviously, we need to do better, because when you look at the numbers, they're not where we want them to be yet, but it's certainly going in the right direction.
Final question before you leave, and I know you have another engagement. What can you do to assure the American people that you're going to stay healthy? Because I think most people want to make certain that you're going to be doing this for quite some time. So what are you doing to make certain that you don't get the virus and that you stay healthy?
Well, I'm regarding getting the virus, I'm, essentially sequestered. I do almost everything, virtually, except when I go down to the White House for the task force meetings. I'm very careful. In the beginning of this, David, I didn't take care of myself very well, particularly with regard to sleep. But, I was trying to work, an 18 to 19 hour day, which is kind of tough, but I'm trying with the advice and the firm hand of my partner in life, my wife, who is a very wise person, is making sure that I do that. So I think I'm going to be around, David. Hopefully we will have more of these interviews.
Thanks very much, and thank you for what you're doing for our country, and I very much appreciate your being here today. Thank you very much, Tony.
Anytime, David. It's always a pleasure to be with you. Anytime.
Thank you.
Thank you, David. And Secretary Clinton, it's so good to be back with you. I know that you were a great admirer of Justice Ginsburg, so let's talk about her here at the outset. She had such an outsized impact on equality and justice in this country. I dare say that so much that we take for granted today, we don't realize that she was responsible for so many of those breakthroughs when it came to credit and pay and ending discrimination in education and in so many areas. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about her legacy and how you remember her and perhaps how she inspired you.
Well, of course I can, and I'm delighted. I think you could not be talking about a better person for a conference on equality and inclusivity. And as you know, Milan, because you were also very active in a lot of the movement around women's equality and rights, Ruth was a trailblazer. She set out the legal thinking that led to a lot of the breakthrough decisions, which really did change our world. It's hard, I think, for younger people to even imagine, but when I was a young woman, I was not eligible for credit or a credit card or a mortgage. It didn't matter how much money I made. I was absolutely prohibited because I was a woman. So these kinds of changes that everybody now just assumes have been around forever really can be attributed to the decades-long effort that Ruth began to knock down the barriers for women's equality, but more than that, for equality and inclusivity across the board. And of course, as you know, she served with great distinction as a law professor and a litigator, and then Jimmy Carter put her on the Court of Appeals.
And it was interesting the way she began to make her case when she was still at the ACLU arguing before the Supreme Court in several instances. And she took on cases involving gender discrimination against men to demonstrate that men too were discriminated against. And this was something we all had to understand, right?
Absolutely. And that was one of the, many examples of her legal acumen and genius, because she knew that under the 14th Amendment, she had a struggle to persuade courts that sex should be given the same level of scrutiny when the government was either passing out or withholding rights and favors as race. And it was quite an argument for her to make. And one of the ways that she did it that was masterfully explained in both the biography of her and the biodoc that was a drama, she took men on as clients, and she made the case looking at all white men judges that, they could relate to, and that began to slowly but steadily tear down the barriers that she was aiming at.
So President Clinton nominated her, only the second woman to ever ascend to the Supreme Court. And I wonder in that period when he was trying to determine who he would indeed nominate, if you perhaps mentioned this woman, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, to him.
Well, you know that I did, Milan, because you were right there conspiring with me. The vacancy opened up, and there were so many people vying for it, and lots of lists coming into the White House of highly qualified people who were being put forth for the president to consider. I felt strongly that he needed to look at women, and at the top of my list was Ruth Bader Ginsburg, because I knew of her work. I admired that work. I knew of her record on the Court of Appeals, where she had continued to make and change the way we think about equality, and where she was a really good colleague, including with then Judge Scalia, who had been elevated to the Supreme Court. So I thought she was not only a strong candidate based on her own abilities and record, but that she could be someone to bring the court to a point of view. I did recommend that the president look at her, and I just got an email earlier today from one of the men who was in the department that processed judges, and he said, well, you were right, and I made the case to Bill that at least he should sit down with her and get to know her and then make his own decision. So on a Sunday, she was kind of smuggled into the White House, told to be totally, dressed down, not looking like an elevated judge in any way, taken up to the residence of the White House, where she joined Bill, who I can't remember was watching football or basketball or one of the sports of the time, and they began to talk. And it was like a master class in legal analysis, and particularly around the Constitution, because Bill had taught constitutional law years before. And when he finished the meeting with her, he said, "Boy, I know what you mean." He was totally sold that she could fill the kind of role that he envisioned for his first appointment to the court.
So we mourn her passing, but we celebrate what she had truly achieved that obviously will continue to make such an impact in years to come. Her most fervent wish, we now know, made from her deathbed and told to her granddaughter, was that she not be replaced until after a new president was elected. She didn't want the court to be dragged through a terrible political battle. She cared so much about the institution of the court and what it represents in our democracy. But that obviously now we know is not going to happen. The president appears to have all of the votes he needs for whoever he will nominate. And I gather we will hear that before much longer. Where does this all go now? Is it up to the American people and the election? How does this play out?
Well, I think you're absolutely right, Milan, that Justice Ginsburg had such reverence for the court and the law and the Constitution that when she dictated that statement to her granddaughter, she was not speaking personally or certainly not as any kind of partisan. She was offering her measured opinion that it would be in the interests of our country and most certainly in the interests of the court so close to an election to allow the election to go forward. And then whoever was elected would be able to choose the next justice. I really respect that. I understand that it's not going to be honored. And now we are left with what will be a very unfortunate display of partisan power to push through whoever the president nominates. And what I hope the American people will pay attention to is not the partisanship and the conflict in the Senate and all, but what's at stake? What's at stake for them? Because one thing about Ruth Bader Ginsburg, she never lost sight of the impact that her decisions had on the people she represented as a lawyer or the people who were involved in the cases she adjudicated as a judge. And I think it's absolutely clear that what's really at stake, first and foremost in this choice, is health care. The court is scheduled to hear yet another challenge to the Affordable Care Act right after the election. So presumably whoever is appointed can participate in some way in that decision. And it really speaks to the fervent desire of the Republicans under Trump and McConnell to get rid of the Affordable Care Act in the middle of a pandemic that has cost us more than 200,000 lives. And what that will mean is that for about 130 million Americans with pre-existing conditions, their insurance costs will go up, assuming they can even get insurance. For more than 20 million, they will lose their policies if the court fulfills the hopes of the Republican majority in the Senate and the White House to repeal and eliminate the Affordable Care Act. But it will also affect many other people, young people on their parents' plans and so much else. And I think that we can get caught up in the contest over who replaces her, but I think Justice Ginsburg would say, keep your eye on what this means. We're heading into an election. It is hard fought. It may result in the change in the White House, and having this seat filled right now, as opposed to waiting until we know who the president is, could very well mean the end of the Affordable Care Act and the loss of health care for millions of Americans who have suffered from COVID-19 and therefore may now have new pre-existing conditions that will render them less affordable for health care.
You know, it's just stunning to contemplate that stake alone. But here we are at the Bloomberg Equality Summit, and issues of women's equality, LGBTQ, racial justice at a time when that is such a prominent issue for our country to address. What happens in these other areas? They too are at stake.
Well, I believe that there has been a longstanding, well-financed effort to do exactly what we're seeing today, and that is to try to fill the courts with people of a certain ideology, a certain point of view, that were selected and groomed by big institutions to be put forward by Republican presidents. And there is no doubt in my mind that we will see considerable turning back of a lot of what we have taken for granted, because it's not only the rights that you just enumerated, it's also corporate power, money in elections, whether or not our government will continue to try to guarantee clean air, clean water, let alone dealing with climate change. Because many of the people who have already been elevated to the federal bench under Trump are people who come with far fewer qualifications than other nominees in the past by both Democratic and Republican presidents. But many come with a preconceived notion that is really outcome driven to limit the power of government, to look after the common good, to try to unite us instead of divide us for the benefit of small groups with certain agendas. So I think we're in for a period of judicial activism that will disregard precedent and undo, or at least limit, the progress that certainly I believe we've been making in trying to come to grips with the complexity of a modern world and all of the demands that it places upon our democracy.
You know, in the context of what's going to be happening to the...
I am placing an order, ladies and gentlemen, to buy Japanese yen at 105,008. Order placed to buy Japanese yen at 105,008. Like James Bond, just not 7, but 8. Yep. Okay, let's see where we will go.
Maybe they have the votes, but they should have to justify and defend what they are doing at this point when they're not providing additional assistance to the unemployed in our country, when they're not helping state and local governments deal with the tremendous fallout of the COVID crisis. And I think that they should have to be held accountable for that before we go and speculate about what might else be considered. Let's focus on the here and now and the consequences of this decision to the vast majority of Americans.
I'd like to ask you about another issue that is fundamentally about equality, and that is the fact that 25 years ago this month, you gave a speech in Beijing at the UN Fourth World Conference on Women, and those words still echo around the world. Human rights are women's rights, and women's rights are human rights. And I wonder, these 25 years later, how you see that progress, how far we've come in this country and certainly around the world, and what more we need to do to accelerate the rate at which we're closing the gap, so to speak?
Well, in the last 25 years, we have seen progress. I would be the first to make that clear. We have seen progress in the number of girls going to school, finishing education, going beyond primary school to secondary school, going on to college. We've seen progress in healthcare, better access to healthcare. We've seen a dropping in maternal mortality and infant mortality that was often disproportionately suffered by female infants. So we've seen progress on those two areas, but we've pretty much stalled out when it comes to the economy and business in terms of women's advancement and women's opportunities. When it comes to politics and government, trying to increase the number of women in government, the women in democracies running for and being elected to positions, and in the area of peace and security. So there is still a lot of work to be done. And as I said in a recent article that I wrote for The Atlantic commemorating the 25th anniversary of that speech, I framed it 25 years ago as enumerating and claiming the rights that women should have in the interests of full equality and participation. But rights are meaningless if you don't have the power to actually obtain those rights. And I think that we've seen how the power to actually move us forward on an equality agenda for women has been stalled in many places, particularly in conflict areas where women are the primary victims of war, certainly in the increasing autocracy and authoritarianism in many countries where often women are the first to suffer when there are crackdowns from authoritarian leaders. And I want to underscore, which will certainly be an issue in the Supreme Court choice and is an issue globally, that women's ability to control their own reproductive health is critical to the independence,
I have to cancel the order. We need to wait for better time. Yeah, it moved, as you can see, too far, too fast. Yeah, so I'll cancel it and we'll wait until it will go down a little bit. Okay, let's see what's going to happen.
To move to the end of that journey, we're far from reaching the equality marker. You had mentioned the pandemic in the context of the Affordable Care Act. And one of the things that COVID has done is truly expose the inequalities in this country and certainly around the world. And, Bill and Melinda Gates, whom you know so well, put out an annual Goalkeepers report that looks at what progress we've made on addressing poverty. And their 2020 report is quite unsettling. And its headline is 25 years of progress wiped out in 25 weeks. There is so much concern, rightful concern, that the pandemic's impacts are going to set us back in very significant ways. I want to end with this because you have done so much in the areas of development, in education, in women in the economy, in so many ways that the progress that you mentioned that's occurred in these 25 years has happened. How do you see us beginning to close this once this is behind us? How do we build back, let alone build back better?
Well, there's a lot of unsettling and quite concerning news coming forth. In our own country, the disproportionate impact on women's employment, the so-called essential workers and healthcare line workers has been falling on women, and women losing their jobs, particularly when they were relatively low wage jobs in retail and elsewhere in the economy, has posed an extraordinary impact on women, particularly women who are either the sole support or contributing support for children. We also know that because of the difficulty of getting daycare up and going, getting school started again, many women are dropping out of the workforce. They are unable to find their way forward to care for their children plus return to work because there is no real support for that. So even in an advanced economy like the United States and European countries that certainly suffered both the double whammy of the health costs and the economic losses, we're going to have to pay particular attention to the disproportionate burden borne by women and girls. In the rest of the world, we're seeing a lot of danger signals coming our way. Domestic violence, insofar as we're able to calculate it, seems to have gone up everywhere, but in particular in more poverty-ridden locations where the suffering is so acute. We've seen, we believe, based again on the evidence we have that the Gates Foundation and others have collected, an increase in taking children out of school so that they can beg and scrounge to try to help support the family when the global economy has been so decimated. We're seeing more child brides. We were working really hard to try to diminish the practice of giving your young daughters away as brides. We've seen reports of increases in human trafficking and labor trafficking. People are desperate, and as the individual governments think about the path forward, I hope that international institutions will play a role in trying to set forth guidelines and frameworks for building back, for trying to be sure we help the most vulnerable among us try to recover. And the other point that I just want to reiterate here is if you don't have a universal healthcare system, such as we do not have in our country, we now know there are long-term effects of COVID. So even though we have a just tragic number of 200,000 lives lost, we have many hundreds of thousands of people who have experienced the virus, and we're seeing more and more evidence that they are having chronic effects, and they might not be eligible for health care, or their ability to do the same work they did before could be impacted by more limited mobility or heart problems or whatever might occur. Multiply that times many over in the developing world, and you can see how someone who was the primary caretaker, someone who was the small farmer might no longer be able to do quite as much. So we do have a huge amount of work ahead of us, and the United States should be a leader in trying to help the not only American public and economy recover, but the world economy. That's good for us if we get more people back into gainful employment and get economic activity going again.
Well, we have a tall agenda ahead of all of us in terms of so many important issues, and certainly equality among them. So we're out of time, but thank you so much for being with us at the Bloomberg Equality Summit. Thank you, Secretary Clinton.
Thank you, Milan.
Good morning. I'm David Weston from Bloomberg, and I'm delighted to welcome the CEO of Delta Airlines, Ed Bastian, to join us. Thank you so much, Ed, for joining us on this very important question of equality. You came out with a very powerful statement to all Delta employees early in the summer in August, I believe, really talking about your commitment to becoming an anti-racist organization. First of all, explain why that's a priority for you personally as well as for Delta. Does it help you fly more planes, make more money, serve your customers better?
Well, thanks for having me, David. I think those are all great questions. The bottom line on this is that we have a responsibility at our company to be not just a great airline, but also a great steward of our resources and help build up our own people, the opportunities for our own team, as well as within our community where we fly and where we invest our time. And one of the things the pandemic has shown to us is the vulnerable have become even more at risk. And it's led to their voices being heard. It's been an interesting phenomenon where, as everything has quieted down, as the world has had to come to a stop, it's allowed us opportunity to listen to those people that are actually have been speaking to us for some time, and maybe we've been too busy to listen. And I know at Delta that's been the case, and we've had a renewed focus on racial equality, systemic bias, and injustice, and all the things that we can do as corporate leaders to make a difference in our community.
Ed, in your statement, you actually referred to the need to listen, as you just said, and talked about having town hall meetings and things like that to really learn more from the people at Delta. Have you done that yet, and what have you learned? Because you knew about this issue before. What perhaps new did you find out from that?
We have done a lot of that. We've had regular town hall meetings on large company-wide, tens of thousands of people, as well as on small-scale matters, and we're doing it in many parts of our company. And you're right, David, we've been focused on diversity and inclusion for a long time, and we've got a pretty good track record. We've been making progress. But the one thing that I have paid a lot closer attention to is disaggregating the information. Diversity and inclusion is a broad umbrella. It includes gender, race, ethnicity, and other areas of opportunity. But when you look at the information and you see underneath the specific groups that are potentially not keeping up with the broader economy or corporate opportunities, it's been the Black community. Within, at least within Delta, we've got 20% of our employees are Black, yet only 7% of the top leaders in the company are. And that's a pretty wide gap that we need to commit to close.
Well, that's something that we see replicated in a lot of U.S. industry, I suspect. Certainly the industry I know about at ABC, we had those challenges. How is the African-American situation somewhat different from other people of color? I mean, there's an issue for all, but as you said, it's somewhat different, perhaps because we have 400 years of slavery, there's history of slavery to account for.
Yep. Yeah, this has been going on for not just decades, but centuries. And the thing that we've learned here at Delta is that we all have a role to play to owning the issue. It's one thing to say that we've got to get better. It's one thing to acknowledge the numbers. As we said, it's important to be transparent about the numbers, but to really understand the reasons and the rationale and put yourself in someone else's shoes. That's where the listening and the understanding and the reflection are coming from. And one of the things we've talked a lot about Delta is also being truth tellers, acknowledging the fact that our company does not have a great record on this in the past and may have some challenges it needs to correct for in order to be a more just company going forward. And while the leaders of the company may not have been here at the time some of those inequities were first initiated, we have to go back and reconcile and make sure we understand what our company's responsibility is, not just our individual responsibilities.
And part of the challenge we have for all of society, business, I think, and perhaps even at Delta is, it's not just enough to say, going forward, we're going to be even. We've got some history we have to make up for. How do you do that without alienating people who are not benefited by the actions?
Well, it's a great question, and you're right. There's a lot of people wondering, well, what about me? Or does that mean I'm going to now be, by implication, disadvantaged relative to an African-American colleague? And the answer is no. The answer is we got to raise the bar for everybody. There are plenty of great, talented leaders within our African-American community that we need to invest more time and more understanding in. And when you look around the room, you see the room is filled with people that look just like you and me. So it's clear that we've had advantages. We may not have been explicit about it, but implicitly we've had advantages, and we've got to bring others along with us too.
Ed, you've mentioned the numbers a couple of times. How do you measure success? How will you know when you've achieved what you need to achieve? And is it basically based on numbers?
It's not based on numbers, David, but one of the things that I know within Delta, and as well as within the corporate community, is when you're transparent and you're held accountable, things get done. People pay attention, and we never want this to be seen as a quota system or lowering the bar, as one might say. This is about ownership and accountability and being able to measure the success that we're having. So numbers are, it's an outcome. It's not the driving force. But when we do see that gap closed, and in the memo you referenced, I've committed to close that gap in half over the next 5 years. So it's not a lot of time to make some pretty good difference. That will be one measure of success. But when I hear from our Black community within Delta that the opportunities, the discussion, the sense of belonging and opportunity is greater than it was, that will tell me that we've really made that difference.
When you talk about closing that gap, for those who haven't had the opportunity to read this memo, and I recommend it to people, you disaggregate those numbers as well. You have the overall population of Delta employees, but then you have management, and then you have a smaller group at the very top. Are you committed to closing that gap across the entire set of different groups?
Yeah, yes, I am, David. In total, we have about 40% of our team are people of color. About 30% in the low 30s are actually in the leadership ranks of the company, more broadly speaking, from frontline leaders on up, are people of color, and about 18% of our officers are people of color. But when you figure out what the Black component, the African American component of that same population skill set is, half of our people of color are Black, but only a third of our top leaders are Black. So you can see that there's been, even within the designation of people of color, there's been some inequity and imbalance there. And that's what we've got to focus on, how we can do better.
What's been the reaction within Delta to your initiative? I mean, my experience is leadership is part figuring out where to go, but it's also figuring out how to get everybody to follow you. And even the best intentioned of people down through the ranks have other priorities. I mean, let's be frank, there's an overall economic downturn, and it's hit Delta particularly hard. Is it a real challenge to pursue these diversity and inclusion goals at a time when your company also has some other challenges?
This is an and, not an or. We need to do both. We need to fix the business. We need to get focused on opportunities to continue to let people know that it is indeed safe to travel in the sky, and it is, and Delta's doing a fabulous job of that. Our customers are telling us that. Our customer satisfaction scores in the most recent month, David, our Net Promoter Score was an 80, all-time high. We've never come close to that. The same number a year ago was 50. So people are telling us you're doing a great job. Customers are telling us, but we also have to bring everybody along with us. And you're right, internally at Delta, there continues to be certain groups that wonder if they're going to be alienated as a result of this focus. The reality is the system is structured to help them succeed, and we need to make certain that system is a broader basket to bring everybody into those same opportunities.
And in a lot of discussions about diversity and inclusion, one of the things we hear is there just isn't the pipeline. Some people call it talent pool to draw from. In fact, we had the head of a major bank just in the last 24 hours got in a little trouble by saying there's not a talent pool sufficient for African Americans. He tried to dial that back. What is your response to that? How do you find that talent pool, if we can call it that?
I don't think it's an issue with talent. We have incredibly talented leaders within the African American community here in our company as well as in our community. And frankly, David, in Atlanta, which is the birthplace of the civil rights movement in our country, there's no excuses for an Atlanta-based company not to be able to tap into phenomenal talent. The question is, I'd pose a little differently, is how do we go deeper into not just the pipeline, into the education systems, into the schools, into the community to help those that are more disadvantaged get off to a better start in life. And that's where we've also been very focused in. And it's not just in the college and university setting, the historically Black colleges where we can continue to do more recruiting from, but going all the way into elementary education in the Atlanta public school systems. And at Delta, we've adopted some schools and we've made them our own. And we've got our employees out there, Black, white, Indian, whoever, reading with the kids and helping them with their math skills and helping them through a difficult period of time with virtual learning. That's where the real impact starts. Junior Achievement is another program that we've been actively engaged in our community in helping to accelerate the development and the learning at younger ages. So people,
at a very early age can see the opportunities to improve are there. And we feel that vested ownership. And I'll tell you, David, and I'm sure you know this, there's nothing like helping kids. And that, in terms of changing your heart and changing your mind around and getting you real vested in making a difference. And we've been able to do that at Delta. At Delta, we've always prided ourselves on being a great community partner, but we can do even more. We can't ever rest on our laurels.
Yeah, I must say, there's a lot of psychic income when you see a young person that you've helped along, somebody who's doing it on their own, but they just need a helping hand. No question about it.
Absolutely.
What have you found that you think particularly works at this point? I mean, some people are experimenting now with basically having applications and promotions done sort of without seeing the face or knowing the race or ethnicity of the person involved. Have you experimented with that? Have you seen anything that you think really makes a difference?
I don't know. We've got a, it's interesting when you mention that, because one thing that we're working in our business on is how do we get to contactless travel and opportunities using biometrics and things of that sort to speed the efficiency of travel and using, as you say, facial recognition technologies. And we've had some interesting pushback from people of color. Saying that they may not be scanned properly and it may be kicked out, and we're working in certain local communities to do better by that. So I think eventually those technologies will work well, but they're still early in their development cycles.
And we've been talking basically about internal within Delta for diversity and inclusion, racial justice, if you will. You also are acting externally as well. You've taken positions with respect to, for example, the Georgia legislation on hate speech and Minnesota reform of the police. What's the theory behind that? What is the role of Delta in the outside world taking positions on fairly controversial subjects like that?
Well, there should be nothing controversial about eliminating and holding people accountable for hate, crime, speech, reform legislation. And as not just members of the Georgia and Minnesota are our two biggest bases of employment, we're the largest employer here in the state of Georgia, and we're one of the largest in the state of Minnesota. We want to hold our legislators and our elected officials responsible for continuing to improve the outcome for all of our citizens in our communities. And, this is an age, David, that, it's everything you do seems like there is politicized. People are always looking for a different agenda or a different, you have a different goal in mind or finding a reason not to get along as compared to get along. And we've got to, as corporate leaders, cut through that. We've got to make certain that we're standing up and being accountable and not being afraid of taking a stand in this. I think when you look at public opinion polls these days, it's interesting. Corporate leaders probably have as high a level of credibility and impact in the public's opinion and responsibility as well for making a difference than they've ever had before. And we've got to lead into that and continue to do better.
Ed, you were involved and maybe thrust into a controversial issue early on in your tenure, I believe, with the National Rifle Association. Tell us about that and what you may have learned from that would be applicable today.
Well, this goes back to the Parkland shooting in Florida, and one of the things that right after the Parkland shooting occurred, the NRA came out with a pretty caustic statement, trying to continue to deflect any responsibility for gun control legislation in our country. And when we saw that happen, the kids at Parkland High School contacted me personally. I'm easy to find, on email or the internet. People, and it's amazing. Within minutes, people will access you, which I like, because I like being accessible. And said, do you realize that on your website that you give NRA members discounts for travel? You're preferencing NRA members versus the public, and how can that be? And I looked into it, and it was a small discount. It was a 10% discount for members to travel to their annual meeting once a year. So it wasn't a broad-based thing. But I told the kids and I told our team, I agreed with them. I don't know why that discount is there, and we should pull it. And but by pulling it, it caused a whole nother set of uproar within certainly here in Georgia, in the state, where NRA has a lot of political influence and support. And they wound up, the state legislator wound up actually not agreeing because of that decision to go along with a tax break. They were ready to approve for Delta. And we wound up losing about $40 million of tax, jet fuel tax breaks because of that decision. And it's at that time I told the governor and the leaders of the state, they need to make their decisions about what they're going to do. I don't agree with them, but we'll make our decisions. And, our values are more important than the $40 million. And it's going to last us. We're going to be around, and we're going to stay in Georgia. We're not going to leave town. There was a lot of discussion whether Delta would actually even leave the state. And I said, we're going to stay and continue to make this state a better place. But we're going to let our values speak for us rather than the tax break.
So, Ed, as you point out, that had some real economic effect on Delta. Maybe even lost some passengers because of it. I don't know. Did you have your board behind you? Because there is a corporate governance issue here. Do you get to decide that all on your own? Does the board have to agree on that position?
David, we had some discussions I had with a couple of the board members, but no, it wasn't a board decision. You don't have time when your values are being examined in today's world. You got to respond, and you need to understand what you stand for and the company's values. And as a result of that, when we saw something that didn't align with our values, that we didn't agree with, that discount for the NRA members, we made that decision. And what I've said is that, at times like this, you don't have time to go and seek consensus. You have to move because you're being evaluated on. And when you don't move, or even if there's a gap in movement, that's an evaluation as a result. So it's more important for companies today to understand what their value set is, what they stand for, and be able to make decisions in support of that without having to go back and check and ask for permission.
Ed, as CEO, how do you choose which social issues to get involved in, which not? I mean, obviously, anti-racism is something you have really staked your flag on, without a doubt. You had the issue with NRA. There are a whole host of worthwhile causes, one might think, things that may appeal particularly to you. How do you pick which ones to go with and which ones to say, you know what, I may agree with that on the merits, but it's not something I'm going to use my position at Delta to back?
It's a great question, David, and it's a political minefield. Right? Once you tip your toe into it, it's hard to get out. But you have to be very careful because there are areas where you can have impact and you can have influence. And I've tried to be very careful to make certain that Delta is seen as an apolitical organization. We're not trying to be political activists. I'm not trying to be a social activist. I've been accused of that both internally and externally at times. I'm really trying to be the very best CEO and lead 75,000 people at Delta who are of all political persuasions and backgrounds and opinions to do better by our own people and by our community. Certainly helping the disadvantaged and helping those that would appear have been facing inequity for quite some period of time within our own company as well as within our community is a cause that I personally relate to and want to help. But you got to be careful when you pick those battles.
Ed, give us a peek inside the C-suite. Do you talk to fellow CEOs about things like racial justice, diversity and inclusion, or for that matter, gun control? Do you talk about things like this and compare notes on, for instance, best practices?
On racial equity, absolutely. And I think that it's a conversation that's going on inside the halls of every major corporation because we're all in a similar situation. Our numbers at Delta are not, hopefully a little better than the average corporation, given that we're based in Atlanta, but everybody has a lot of work to do. We're all in a period of trying to understand what we can do. We don't have a lot of great role models amongst corporate CEOs, which is an evidence of the fact that our black colleagues have not had the same access to the C-suite as maybe our white colleagues have. One person I hold in high esteem is Ken Frazier from Merck. I've been in contact with him over this period of time. You talk about an incredible leader who's actually right in the forefront of the two big issues of our day, both battling the pandemic and developing a cure to save the planet, as well as being an icon as a leader who's managed through as a black man to gain the leadership of one of the most important companies in the world. How he did that and what we can all learn from that to do better.
And it's great to have role models like that. And for that matter, if I may say so, you, Ed Bastian. Thank you so much, Ed Bastian. He is the CEO of Delta Airlines, speaking about what they're doing at Delta on racial equality. And now it's my great pleasure to turn it over to my colleague, Francine Lacqua, who is going to be talking with NatWest CEO Allison Rose.
I really couldn't be more happy to be joined by Alison Rose, NatWest Group Chief Executive, also the first woman to lead a major UK bank. Thank you so much for joining us, Alison. There's a lot to talk about because we're trying to discuss in 20 minutes, striving for equality in business, finance, and society. I feel like we need 4 hours, but unfortunately, we just don't have the time for that. Are you disappointed that in 2020, we still have to talk about diversity and equality? Or actually, have we really made progress over the last 5 years?
Yeah, I'm always going to be disappointed that we have to talk about it, because I think although we have made incredible progress, if I think in my career from when I started to now where I am, there's been amazing progress, but it's just not fast enough. And I think we'll need to continue to talk about it from a gender perspective and just more explicitly from an inclusion perspective until we don't have to talk about it again. So I'm always going to be impatient that the progress isn't fast enough.
What does COVID actually mean for equality and diversity and fairness in society? Is it almost a great equalizer, or does it just accentuate the differences?
Well, I think in some ways it is a great equalizer. It's forced us to really look at what's going on, and there are a number of things happening, both in terms of demographic split, in terms of diversity and inclusion, and you have other issues happening, and I'm sure we'll talk about it, around Black Lives Matter as well. So COVID has really forced, I think, a rethink and a restart and an opportunity for us to address some of these issues.
Do you think that the pandemic is also almost like a way of making sure that businesses feel like they have a purpose? Do you think that's reinvigorated that at NatWest?
I think it absolutely has. But I mean, I announced a new strategy in February, which seems a lifetime ago now, pre-COVID, and we launched a new strategy about being a purpose-led bank. And I think it's really critical for businesses to have a purpose. We talked about creating a purpose that would create long-term sustainable value for shareholders. Absolutely, we've got to be a business that contributes, but also that thinks more broadly than just single shareholders, about all of its stakeholders. And we've focused on wanting to unlock the potential that exists in families and businesses right the way up and down the country of our customers that we support. And for me, I think every business has to think about its impact and the difference it can make. We actually focused the 3 focus areas I launched in February around focusing on enterprise, helping entrepreneurs and businesses and removing the barriers that affect them, financial education and inclusion, and climate. And so I think that becomes even more accentuated in a COVID environment. And for me, it's really helped determining our response to COVID as well. It's been a real North Star for people.
Is that because you just want to do a bit of good in the world, because you want the next generation to be on a better footing, or does it just make business sense?
It makes business sense. I think it's a fundamental imperative for having sustainable businesses. I think you have to think as a business leader more broadly around your customers and the communities that you support, as well as the environment you're creating for your colleagues. And I think that creates value more broadly than just short-term value. You want to create long-term value. So it's absolutely good business sense. But obviously, big businesses have a responsibility to recognize their impact in the communities that they live and work. That's how all of my bankers think. And I've seen when you don't think like that, you can do harm, and you've got to be multidimensional, think about all your stakeholders. So at the core, it's good business sense, and it's about creating long-term value, and it has repercussions for how the value that you create more broadly than shareholder value in your business.
Given, COVID is going to be pretty tough. I don't know what will happen in like a couple of months or the next couple of years, but, it looks like we could have a massive recession at the end of the pandemic. Given some of the things that you've outlined and that other business leaders have outlined, do you think we'll have a fairer and greener society?
I think we have to. There is a real opportunity here and it's a phrase that we've used around building back better. I think as as we come out of this pandemic, what you've seen is actually an acceleration of some underlying trends that were already happening. So we know that climate is a massive challenge for our generation, for businesses and globally. And actually, this is the opportunity to see how we can support that. But I think what you're seeing is an acceleration of trends and an opportunity to build back better. And I think balancing, for me, being a purpose-led organization means balancing those needs across all your stakeholders. And we should all be embracing that so that we can make a difference and create more sustainable and equal value.
So concretely, what does that mean, Alison? How are you going to hire differently? How are you going to treat your talent within the organization?
Yeah, well, I think for me, talent is really important. And any business, any organization should be thinking about how do I get the most diverse talent within my organization? Because if you're bringing in that diversity of thought, that creativity, that constant learning, you're going to get better results. And I think, one of the things that we're seeing from the recession that's coming, from some of the early signs, it is the younger generation who are going to struggle more coming out of COVID. And so making sure we're hiring good, diverse talent, young people from diverse backgrounds to grow the next generation of talent and contribute to the organization is critical. I mean, we've really focused on making sure we're continuing to recruit our graduates. We're welcoming 260 graduates who are joining us next week. We kept our internship program going, albeit we did it remotely during the summer. And we focused on hiring apprentices from different economic backgrounds that would not normally be attracted to banking or captured in the normal way. So I think you've got to think really differently about your talent and recognize the demographic and this younger generation who are going to be affected by COVID more, and making sure we reach out and do more to help them. And that's on recruitment. And then I think more broadly, one of the things we're doing is how can we help people start businesses? I've got a real focus on female entrepreneurs, but all entrepreneurs. And also, how can you help people manage their finances and have confidence around their financial capability? Because that's a core requirement. So we can do more to educate around that as well.
I know, Alison, you've done a lot of work, to try and understand some of this underrepresentation. Why do a lot of businesses don't have a more diverse workforce? Is it at entry level? Do people drop off after a certain while? What's the secret sauce to retaining good people from different backgrounds?
Yeah, look, for me, it's all about the culture of the organization you create. You've absolutely got to have the policies in place to hire and recruit in a very diverse way. So, my graduate intake this year, we've got 57% female, but we've also got 40% BAME coming in. So you've got to attract diverse talent, but then you've also got to nurture them through the organization, address unconscious bias, remove the barriers that will be there in an unconscious way, and create an environment and a culture that talent can thrive regardless of their background. So, that's one of the challenges. There's no one silver bullet that will fix anything. So you've got to put interventions in place. But fundamentally, you've got to have a culture of an organization that is really going to embrace inclusivity and talent and have the pull and push factor to allow people to thrive.
I know you also set out a goal, I think, to help create some 50,000 new businesses that are led by either females or BAME, chief executives, also outside London. Maybe why are more organizations not doing that?
Yeah, well, I'm encouraging as many organizations as I can. When I launched the Rose Review, which was looking at female entrepreneurship, and we took a broader view, I think it's incumbent on everyone who can help should help, and it's good business sense. So more support that we can put in to encourage entrepreneurs and help entrepreneurs survive through that difficult period when they're starting up businesses, then you're creating new jobs, you're contributing to the economy. I'm really pleased, actually, the result from the Rose Review is we now have 67 organizations signed up to the banking code to help entrepreneurs, and our council that was set up to really encourage more VC investment has set an ambitious target to get 30% of investment to female founders or co-founders by 2030. So I think that's a real sign that people are willing to help and to do more, and laying out what you can do to really make a difference, I think should encourage people to get involved and help remove barriers that will encourage enterprise. And enterprise doesn't just exist in the big cities, it exists everywhere. And what we've seen from previous economic recessions is as unemployment goes up, that may be the trigger to encourage people to start their own businesses. So there's a real opportunity to try and address not just the barriers to enterprise, but also helping people back into employment as well, if they want to start a business.
And Alison, what will you do to increase gender diversity at NatWest Group?
So we're very clear that we've set targets. I'm a great believer in if you don't measure it, it doesn't get done. So we have a very broad program around helping encourage women coming into banking, encouraging girls to think about banking. I have a program called Dream Bigger, which goes into schools and encourages girls to think about finance as a career, to think about entrepreneurship as a career, to work on resilience and really encourage more people into the pipeline. But we set targets at our top 4 levels. We have a fully diverse represented board. My executive team now is over 30% female, and we have targets at our CEO -4 level right the way through the organization to encourage all elements of diversity and inclusivity. And all of my team are encouraged to embrace it, as well as broader elements of inclusivity. But I think you set targets, you put interventions in place, and you create a culture that hopefully will encourage people and allow that talent to thrive.
Why do you think not enough females actually join banking in the first place? Is it a cultural thing? Is it a perception? Is it seen as too aggressive?
I think historically, the financial sector has been very male dominated. When I started my career, I joined areas where I was the only woman in the room, and that was, for a long time part of the environment I operated in. So I think it sort of starts from having a perception of being like that. But the culture of banking has changed enormously. We need to do a better job of explaining the fact you can have 1,000 different careers in one organization and what an exciting environment it is, and then create the culture that people can really be their whole selves when they come here. And increasingly seeing more women come into banking. What we need to do is now get more women through into executive positions so that they really can make a difference, so that you've got a really diverse workforce. I know certainly being part of diverse teams is fantastic because you get different perspectives, different challenge, different creativity, which makes you more competitive. So making sure we can really articulate the attraction of this industry, I think will encourage more women to join.
Do you ever get pushback with some of these initiatives or some of the things you're trying to do and change?
No, I mean, a lot of what I get when I've driven diverse debates and the cultural change, it is a ask for help from people. Why am I not attracting more women? Why do I have an inclusivity problem? How do we address this? And a lot of it is unconscious bias. You have to look at talent in a very different way rather than through the lens with which you would typically look at it. So generally, I don't get pushback. I get an ask for how can I get the best talent? How can I get help? And I think explaining the business case, explaining the imperative, this isn't a nice to do. This is an absolute business imperative. And so it's asking for help, asking for interventions. So no, I'm very lucky. My team are fully on board about creating an inclusive culture. We've got very high representation in our top 4 layers, so that's good. Lots more to do. I'll continue to be impatient. I'll continue to drive the targets, but I think nobody's got one silver bullet to fix this, so everybody's looking for help and sharing best practice. It's one of those areas where it's a non-competitive environment, so we're all looking to learn from each other.
How has the Black Lives Matter movement actually changed the way you look at diversity and inclusion at NatWest?
Yeah, I mean, I think the Black Lives Matter issue has really been, a tough environment and a tough conversation for lots of people to have. But what it's done is it's brought the conversation to the fore. And it's been a pretty emotional experience for a lot of my colleagues from the BAME background, and particularly my Black colleagues, and understanding the experience they're going through, the experience in their own personal lives, and what's happened to them and what this means to them has really brought it to the forefront. We have, I've asked my employee-led network to run a task force within the organization, and we're having some pretty uncomfortable conversations to understand, you know, the challenges that our Black colleagues have gone through in their lives and in their careers, and really what it means to be an inclusive environment. So it's really stimulated the debate. It's challenging us to think differently. It's making us think about how we should be supporting, you know, not just our colleagues, but our customers, the broader communities who we support every day, but to understand what's happening from their perspective, and really taking a look at whether we truly have a progressive and inclusive culture, and that everyone feels that way. And until everybody does, we know our job's not done.
So have you taken extra action to support, you know, specific causes on Black Lives Matter?
Yeah, well, we've had a BAME target in our organization for a while, but the specific action that we've taken is we launched a task force led by our employees and ran a cultural survey to ask what should we do to really make a difference. And actually, that team are coming back to the executive team this week to talk about the recommendations and measures. We have 10 different recommendations and actions we're specifically going to take to improve the culture, inclusivity, very specifically through a BAME lens.
Do you believe that big business needs to have a point of view on all of these issues?
I do think we need to have a point of view, because we are dealing every day with thousands of our colleagues and our customers and communities where this is impacting their lives. And so, you know, when you're dealing with that and have such a broad representation, I think it's important that your organization is seen, your colleagues see you and understand what you represent. So I think it is important that we have a view, because we can have an impact.
Is that for your customers, or is it for, you know, the people that work for NatWest, or both?
For both. I think it's for both. You know, my organization is dealing with customers, and if we are not reflective of the customer base that we serve, then we're going to be out of touch. For our colleagues, they've got to feel that they have an environment where they are recognized and can thrive, and their home life is as important as their work life. So I think it's really important across our customer base and our colleagues.
When you look at some of, you know, the government schemes put in place, you know, furloughs, but I'm also thinking of apprenticeships, do you feel like they understand, you know, what needs to happen in the next 12 to 18 months to really make sure that something changes after this, you know, pretty harsh 2020?
Yeah, I think there is a real understanding of the challenging times ahead, and undoubtedly, you know, everyone's wrestling with what has been a health crisis that's triggered an economic crisis, and there are consequences that, you know, we still don't know yet. The real long-term damage to the economy and the underlying damage isn't yet known. But I think some of these issues that we're now talking about, which I think it's really important that we do talk about, around inclusivity, around the challenges in terms of social inequality, around the impact that business can have more broadly, are important issues that we should be talking about. And so in the discussions that we're having with government, when we're talking with our colleagues about planning for the future, we're thinking about how those issues should affect our recruitment, how we treat our customers, what sort of products we need. So I think it's it's very important. It's on the agenda as we're thinking about the recovery of the economy and the support we need to put in place.
What's the best piece of advice you would give to someone who says, you know, sometimes when I see, you know, inequality or injustice, someone being treated unfairly or not right in the workplace or elsewhere, I want to speak up, but I don't really know how to find the right tone. I mean, I'm sure you've had, you know, deal with that. All of us really have. But what kind of advice would you give?
I think I would always encourage everyone to have a voice. One of the things I say within our organization is that Everybody has a voice. So even if you are not the victim of that inequality, walking past it means that you are silently endorsing it. And a lot of the time we talk about the destructive nature of microaggressions, the everyday that can wear people down. So I think it's really important that we are all allies to each other, and therefore we should speak up on behalf of the culture we represent and the inequality that we see. And I think it's really important to create a culture where people can have those uncomfortable conversations. We've been talking, with my colleagues, I've been participating in some of them talking about white fragility and white supremacy. Those are uncomfortable topics for people to talk about. But I think building understanding the language allows you to have those uncomfortable conversations. And I think it's really critical. This isn't particularly on Black Lives Matters. This isn't up to our Black colleagues to talk about it. It's up to all of us to talk about it so we can build understanding and solutions.
Alison, thank you so much for joining us today. Alison Rose, and thank you so much to all of our viewers and listeners for joining us. Thanks to the speakers that we've had throughout the day. Next, we'll be focusing on reparations and entrepreneurship. And for those of you who are social media friendly, and it's 2020, so I hope all of you are, a reminder that you can follow us on @Bloomberg Live and also join the conversation using the hashtag, so hashtag Bloomberg Equality.
2020, a devastating year rocked by the pandemic and protests. More than 26 million people infected with coronavirus. Too many lives lost. Some communities are harder hit. In the United States,
health disparities have always existed for the African American community.
In Europe,
it's impossible to be with distance with each other.
While the world reels from COVID-19, a string of police killings of unarmed black Americans shocked the world, sparking global protests. The need for inclusion and equality has never been more urgent.
Consumers want to see commitment and long-standing commitment to the black community and support.
At the Bloomberg Equality Summit, we convene leading figures in business, finance, and health for uncomfortable but crucial conversations that cannot wait. It's now or never. This is the Bloomberg Equality Summit.
Hi, everyone. I'm Shortia Brantley, Deputy New York Bureau Chief and Senior Editor of Bloomberg Equality. I'm so pleased you could join us for the Bloomberg Equality Summit. Our theme is Now or Never, Inclusion in the Age of Disruption. 2020 has reminded us of the urgency with which we need to create a more equal society. We simply cannot wait. This next session focuses on how to close the Black wealth gap. What are the solutions to creating true financial equity? Does it involve reparations of one form or another? We'll get to that in a minute. But first, I'd like to welcome Sanj Bhairo, Vice President, Operations and Customer Growth, Google Cloud EMEA, our sponsor for this session.
Hello, my name is Sanj Bhairo, and I'm the Vice President for Operations and Customer Growth here at Google Cloud EMEA. And it's a pleasure to open up this discussion as part of today's Bloomberg Equality Summit. For more than 22 years after our founding, Google is an organization of curious, talented, passionate people who aim to build products that create opportunity and value for everyone. Diversity, equity, and inclusion are critical to that mission. I work for Google Cloud, and our mission is to help accelerate every organization's ability to digitally transform their business through data-powered innovation, leveraging the best of Google. And we have customers in more than 150 countries who partner with us to help them digitize, develop new capabilities, and grow. And as builders of technology that empower people and organizations, we believe a representative workforce and a culture of belonging helps us serve our customers. That's why we've worked hard to implement actions to develop a more representative workforce, launching programs that support our communities, and building products that better serve our users. This work will never be done, and as we know, we must continue to expand our talent pool externally and continue to evolve our culture internally. And since 2014, we've published a diversity annual report to show progress towards our diversity goals and to share what we've learned along the way. And for the first time, this year's report takes a closer look at our own pace of growth. It's promising to see that the growth of many of our underrepresented employees is outpacing Google's overall employee growth. But even incremental progress in hiring and progression and retention is still hard won. Not only a holistic approach to fighting systemic racism and inequality will produce a meaningful, sustainable change. Earlier this year, our CEO of Google and Alphabet, Sundar, shared additional commitments to help address inequity specific to the Black community, developed in partnership with members of Google Black's Leadership Advisory Group and our Black Plus Googlers. Our commitments center around building equity within our own organization, developing products for change, helping create economic opportunity, improving education, and supporting organizations working towards racial justice. Our leadership will continue to work closely with our Black Plus Googler community and other communities to develop initiatives that support long-term solutions. I'm looking forward to today's discussion and to hearing all of your ideas, and I want to thank you all for joining. I hope today's forum helps energize all of us to keep driving for continued and sustainable change. Thank you.
Thanks, Sanj. Before we get started, we have a few housekeeping announcements to ensure you all can enjoy the program. For today's event, we have partnered with Listen, an audio-to-text platform that is transcribing today's discussions in real time, making the event more accessible. You can access THISN for the real-time transcription via the link in the session description. If you experience any issues with audio or video quality while viewing, try to refresh your browser or use the chat box in the bottom right corner of your screen for support. You will be able to submit questions during the interviews, and we hope you do so. Please engage with us. While we're probably not going to get to all of you, we'll try our best. To submit a question, please click on the white tab on the right-hand side of the video window and submit your question. If you note your name and location, we'll give you a shout out. Please engage with us on social media using hashtag Bloomberg Equality. With that, I'd like to hand it over to my colleague, David Weston, who is in conversation with Brian Moynihan, Chairman and CEO of Bank of America. Bank of America is also a sponsor of today's event.
So, Brian Moynihan, welcome back to Bloomberg. It's great to have you here, particularly for this occasion. And I'm going to start by putting you on the spot, something that may make you uncomfortable. You've been named Banker of the Year by Euromoney, and you've also been named CEO of the Year by CEO Magazine. I know you always like to talk about the team, but congratulations. I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't congratulate you on those two really prestigious awards.
Well, thank you, David. And it's an honor to be recognized by both those august groups, but you know, it is the team that makes us all successful. So it's an award that I accept on behalf of my teammates and all the great work they do.
So, Brian, I think part of the reason why you received those awards is because of the work you've done on equality and diversity and inclusion. And let's start with this $1 billion commitment, actually, on racial equality as well as economic opportunity. Give us a sense of how you decided to do that. What led you to that decision?
Well, it was interesting. It was kind of a coalescence of the different events. Our team had been working this under Ann Finucane's leadership and with Tom Montag, actually. About a year and a half ago, we had a lot of people come on to our senior groups, including Raj Chetty, who's done a lot of leading research on economic mobility. We had studied it in some markets where we have a big presence, Charlotte being the one, and obviously where our headquarters is. And we were kind of working this question, how do you create more opportunity in the African-American community, in the Hispanic community, and other communities of color? And what are the barriers? And it's, you know, housing, education, skill sets, and things like that. And then that was going along, and then we had obviously the huge crises beginning of racial justice and criminal justice and social justice, beginning with the George Floyd. And so when Ann and team brought it, it was a program of X size. I said, let's double it. Let's do it over 4 years. And let's get serious about how we, in addition to all the great work we do, whether it's the money we do with the community development financial institutions or the work we do in charity, let's put another $250 million per year on a line to help actually do our part to solve these issues and help drive mobility and opportunity in our communities.
And Brian, as you suggest, that's over and above the amounts of money that you spend from the foundation on charities every year. So give us a sense of how you're going about this. As I understand, you've already decided how to deploy the first $300 million. What is that going to go for, and how will that address some of those issues you just listed?
Sure. So we have $1 billion allocated across sort of 4 platforms. One is small business and entrepreneurship. Another is education and skillings and job creation. Another is housing. Another is health. And so some that goes from the very tactical. You had the healthcare crisis, which affected these communities more than other communities, and that's been statistically proven. So we have been doing a lot. Recently, we announced that $25 million would go into sort of near-term health initiatives. That is things like masks to shelters, masks to community health places, masks to school systems. Just the other day, we did 100,000 masks to the Providence school system, for example, through our 92 markets, really helping with a near-term thing that wearing a mask will help the disease spreads stay down, and therefore society can return to normal. But broader stated, it's $1 billion across those 4 big initiatives. Just recently announced $300 million as allocations, for lack of a better term. $50 million to minority depository institutions. We've completed 4 of the investments already. We're working on another 4 or 5. These are institutions which are African-American owned, and ultimately we'll do Hispanic owned ones also, where we're putting in 4 to 5% of the common equity to give them the capital to grow. We did another $25 million, as I said, in sort of the community health initiatives. We've said that we're going to do $200 million in equity, growth equity in our 90 markets to businesses that are owned by Hispanic business owners, African-American business owners, and Asian business owners to help them grow faster. And this will be smaller sized investments. And I call on my colleagues across the industry to come. This is not a fund that we want to drive. We want it to be companies in Market X or Market Y or Market Z putting a fund together to help these companies get growth capital. And that's one area. And then the other place, that was a $200 million allocation. And then we started on some of the job stuff. And there's two different thought processes there. One is with the HBUs and HSIs, which is more four-year college, and how we help in the career development pathways for those colleagues in those colleges. The other piece, which is different, which is skills development with the community colleges. Again, community colleges would serve the communities of color and helping develop skills in the job set there. So that's where we're going on. Those grants went out, are going out as we speak, and it's all about helping in every community. And by the way, this is not just about Bank of America, it's also catalyzing efforts where other CEOs and other companies can join in to help create jobs. So we've done a lot of this in Charlotte and other markets, which we're very proud of, but it still needs a lot more work needs to be done.
So there's a lot of good work being done here, but you are a banker at base. Let's talk about those minority deposit institutions that you referred to, 50 million of the first 300 dedicated to that. Give us a sense from your understanding of the question of the underbanked and the unbanked in our minority communities.
Well, I think the idea really is how do we create more and more capacity, lending capacity as institutions. So the 50 million we put in, when fully deployed, will, think if you can multiply times 14. So that's, $750 million of loans just on that new equity. And so these institutions have long histories, have done a great job. Some are bigger, some are smaller. We've had relationship with them. We already have about $100 million deposits in them, but that's deposits that then they can lend out. This is equity so they can get deposits from other people and grow. And so my view is we do a great job of lending in all communities. Our LMI capabilities in housing and our small business lending is the largest in the country. But they're just, this is to have a fully competitive place and help these institutions be more competitive, who are focused in the communities, and our job is to help them grow.
So as I understand, you've made investments thus far, I think, in 3 minority-oriented or owned lenders. Do you expect to take positions in more of those entities?
Well, we've already completed the 4th, as I said. And the idea is we are in discussions with a lot of them, and all of them, and we will continue to work through them. We began with the ones we had the strongest relationship on a deposit over the years, and we're working towards all of them. There's a list of them, and we're just going one from another, and the team's doing a great job. And 4 are done, and we've got a few that hopefully complete over the next few weeks. But the idea was to get the money into those institutions to help them grow and get it in there fast, and that's what we've been doing.
So this is a lot of money and for a good cause. Give us a sense about the balance between the private sector versus the public sector. I mean, how much of the problem we've had, frankly, let's talk about it, for 400 years of systemic racism can really be addressed in the private sector? What do we need from the public sector to help that effort?
Well, I think you need some catalysts. So in housing, for example, you need more help in the public sector in terms of authorization of housing development. So we do $5 billion a year already in lending in low and moderate income communities, community development lending. Sometimes that's institutional commercial property. Sometimes, but the dominant share is housing. But the problem is it's just not enough. In Charlotte alone, the study that the group of CEOs that we've worked on has come up with 30,000 housing unit shorts. In Boston, there's a similar amount. So these markets need it. So what we did in Charlotte, to give you an example of how this really works, is we put in some more risk capital along with a lot of other institutions that we built up a $60, $70 million more, think of it as more equity or subordinated debt, which can be leveraged in the traditional lending that we and other institutions do. But so what can the public sector do? They can permit the housing faster, they can get it done faster, so that the pace at which it can be built is fast. And that's one of the needs is whether it's in infrastructure, as they call it, in housing, is really the permitting process. The money's there, the capital will come, but you've got to get the authorization to build the units. And also on the other side is to help us, frankly, keep people in their homes in the crisis we're in now from being evicted. And that group of CEOs has authorized eviction work, and we've had the law firms, the law departments of our firm, our company, and others do pro bono work to build the ability for tenants to be represented and So there's all aspects of it, but really what the public side needs to do is to permit, drive the authorization part of it.
So, Brian, that's all in the communities you serve, the economy at large. Let's talk about within Bank of America itself, because you've gotten also recognition for how you're handling questions of equality, diversity, inclusion within Bank of America. Let's start with just how you're handling your situation with your employees in this coronavirus crisis.
Well, when the virus hit, we got a sense, because we obviously have teammates in Asia, you've started to sit there and say, how do you take care of the situation as best you can? And the three basic elements: you got to be, really support your teammates, because we depend on those great teammates to make the company work. So we had a teammate-centric view, then we had a customer view, and then we had a community view, and all that will redound to the shareholder benefit, because it means that we're stronger and more capable. And so what we did is we started immediately with our teammates, one, assuring them that they'll have jobs, no layoffs for 2020. Secondly, helping them think about it from their standpoint, what they needed. And one of the big things they needed as schools closed up and their kids came home that they expected to be in school and they were trying to work at home was childcare. So we developed a childcare plan that contributed $100 a day to our teammates to hire someone to help take care of their kids during the day so they could be focused on work and do a great job for their kids in terms of education. We've had probably 1.3 million of those days used so far. We've continued through year end for our teammates, and we think it's critical. So that was another piece. Then the mental health work, which is one of the things that we're all going to be facing with and dealing with here, is the mental health aspects of this. So we made free mental health consultations, and that's up 40-50% year over year. And I think all companies and all employers should really be thinking about that question, because the stress of the situation's high. We then went to the question of commuting benefits and things. So those teammates that still had to come to work, and more importantly, probably than anything else, we really went after the healthcare side for them in terms of the safety and soundness of masks and gloves and barriers and all these things early on, and then getting the people home that weren't necessary to be at work. So we ended up with 90% of people working from home. And it's been a lot of great work by Sherry Bronstein and her team and the group working on it. But it was let's keep our teammates safe, keep them comfortable mentally, keep them comfortable as best we can physically, and then give them the ability to contribute and help serve our customers. Because remember, the customer demands went through the roof at the same time.
Brian, at the very beginning of the coronavirus, you made a commitment you were not going to be cutting staff, at least for this calendar year. Some of your competitors, your peers, if I could put it that way, have now said they're going to have to start cutting staff. How long can you keep that up as a practical matter at Bank of America?
Well, we manage headcount extremely tightly for years, so it's not a new thing to try to keep. And so we kept our expenses basically flat for the last 4 or 5 years. And so the idea is to use the limited attrition we have. Our teammate scores came back in the middle of this coronavirus, the highest they've ever been, up dramatically, both on the D&I score, which is a proprietary score we're doing, and on the base, sort of satisfaction scores. So the teammates are happy and attrition's down. But basically by managing the attrition and stuff, we try to manage the headcount down. So we stayed about flat during this thing, even though we've added a lot of teammates to work in the branches since we had the high-risk teammates that were out and therefore couldn't go back into work in the branches. We've hired a lot of extra call center operators, and I think it's the job of management just to keep managing that flow. And we made the commitment because what we didn't want people to do is be worried about their job at a time when they were going through stress. And then, the job then as management is to manage through the flow of people leaving for retirement, people leaving for whatever reason they want, not replace those jobs and spread that work out to the other teammates as we get more and more efficient over time, and then let the headcount drift down.
What is your thinking on the business case for that? I mean, the moral case for it, I think, is pretty clear, given the stress that so many people are under, so many difficulties that were unexpected and undeserved. But what about the business case? How does it help you, Bank of America shareholders, on the bottom line?
Well, if you think about the employees, taking care of those employees means they can do a better job for customers. So what did we have to do? We did 350,000 PPP loans. And we had 10,000 people we brought from around the company to work on that. People were volunteering on Easter weekend to make sure we got those PPP loans for the system from lines of business that had nothing to do with small business or even business lending. So you needed those teammates to do those things. Now we have 3,000 people going to work on forgiveness. We need the people to do that. We need people to go and work in the call centers, because when the branches weren't open, the customer inquiries came to the call center. So we had a lot of people go on the phones, and we did 100,000 computers and screens to people's homes so they could work. And so think about that. And so you needed the capacity. The work didn't go away. It could have shifted where it went on, but the work didn't go away. We grew. We're going to have one of the better core growth years in consumer checking accounts than we've had, even with the crisis. And so our digital capabilities are great, but it still takes people to help make that all work. So the idea is you need those teammates to be talented. That's the shareholder case. And so if you think about it, in the first half of the year, we've earned $8 billion plus after tax. We put up $11 billion of reserves. Our capital ratios have gone up. Our reserves have been doubled. And that's a pretty good place in the worst economic quarter in American history, potentially.
Brian, you mentioned the payroll protection program loans, and I know that Bank of America was a really big player in that space. We've seen some reports of some difficulties with some other banks, with some people maybe making some loans they shouldn't have made. Do you have any issues like that with Bank of America? Was it clean as far as you can tell at this point? You got that much money, that many loans, it's awful hard to know.
Yeah, we did our best all through the thing that's one of the reasons why I had so many people on it. We had the people who did it, the people who checked what they did, the people who checked what they did, all to make sure that we buttoned up the files. Our experience back in the mortgage environment where, things after the fact got turned around on us, we said, let's not let that happen. So we spent a lot of money in terms of making sure between external help in some cases, but mostly internal people, checking, and we feel good about where we are.
So Brian, let's turn to the question more broadly of diversity and inclusion at Bank of America. I know that you've been a champion of this from the beginning. Explain what you're doing. This is something that's very much in the mind of people with all of corporate America, and particularly with banks right now, when we look at the extent to which there really is diversity, particularly as you go up the line in the organization.
Yeah, so if you think about it, there's diversity, which we have, which is representation. There's inclusion, which is more how I feel when I work at Bank of America. But the reason why we do all this goes back to our operating principles of responsible growth. We got to grow, no excuses. We've got to grow with the right risk. We've got to grow on a customer-focused basis, and we have to grow on a sustainable basis. And sustainability means drive operational excellence, because that generates the efficiencies to pay for everything we do. Share our success with our communities. Back to our early discussion. But most importantly, be the best place for people to work. And so to be the best place for people to work, you got to be the best place for everybody to work. And so that's our basic view. So D&I has been critical to Bank of America for a long period of time. So when we think about it, we basically measured at every level in the company, and the business reviews my teammates have with me go down each level. And what our goal is to have our teammate base at every level in the company. There's 8 levels in our company. It used to be 13, and we brought it down to 8, going to your earlier question about how you get a company more efficient. At every level in this company, the diversity of that level represents a diverse society, so by ethnicity in America. And so that's where the focus is. So we watch that go up. So we're very diverse from the top. 6 women on our board of directors, 2 African Americans, Hispanic, Latino. Our management team, the people who work for me, are about half women. Our management team is very diverse, and we work through the system. And we know the pockets. We know exactly where we got to go. We put some announcements out, ANEC did, in the wealth management business about where we need opportunities to drive success. We know where the areas we're weaker or stronger in. It is not mysterious. It's very granular, and I try to hold, in that case, Andy accountable, and he holds his direct reports accountable, and they hold their direct reports accountable, because this goes right through the system of how do we get to be diverse. Inclusion is something else, which is more about how you feel. And so we measure that basically with about 15 years ago, we were trying to find out how do you measure inclusion, because it's a feeling. And so we went out and sought whether other people could measure it, and we couldn't find any measures. So we said, well, let's create a measure off a series of questions about how people are doing that we ask every year. But on top of that, we had to say, so what do we mean by it? And the story was, the team wanted to go out and hire some consultants. I was not CEO. I was just but I was the head of the Global Diversity Inclusion Council then. And the team wanted to go out and hire consultants and do it. And I said, let's just ask our teammates what they think. And so how we define America is defined at Bank of America is defined by what a teammate said. I want to be able to come to Bank of America and bring who I am inside the door and not have to leave it there and pick it up on the way home. And so that's how we define it. And so what we try to do is achieve that feeling in our teammates by having them know that through the development, through their affinity groups they work in, through all different structures we have, that no matter who they are, they can bring themselves through that door every day at work and be as successful as they want to be, and then take it home with them.
Okay, Brian Moynihan, thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate it. And once again, congratulations, CEO of the Year and Banker of the Year the same year. It's really quite the honors. Thanks, Brian. Great to talk to you.
Thank you, David, and make sure you stay safe.
Yeah, and you as well.
Hi, I'm Jacqueline Simmons, Senior Executive Editor of the Americas at Bloomberg in New York. And joining me in London is Joanna Place, Chief Operating Officer at the Bank of England, a position she's held since 2017. To be clear, she's been at the bank for more than 30 years, and previous roles include Head of Monetary and Financial Statistics, Head of Customer Banking, and before her current role as CEO, she's Executive Director of HR at the bank. Welcome, Joanna.
Thank you very much.
So I could explain your remit at the bank and how it relates to discussions of race and gender. You do a much better job. Can you give us a brief overview of your purview and how it fits into this broader discussion of diversity at the bank?
Of course. So at a very high level, as Chief Operating Officer, one of my responsibilities is of the HR department, who lead our diversity initiatives. But it's really important to remember that diversity is a responsibility of every single person in the bank. So when I was HR director, I made it very clear that diversity wasn't just an HR issue, it was for everybody. And we introduced the inclusion strategy. So my role really is twofold. One is I'm the diversity champion of the bank, and that's part of my role as the Chief Operating Officer, but also as part of the executive team and as a member of the bank staff, we each have a personal responsibility to all forms of diversity.
So, Jenna, the Bank of England made headlines when it issued an apology this summer for the time its former governors and directors had ties to the slave trade. Can you explain the context, the timing, and events leading up to the decision to make a public apology?
Of course. So just to backtrack a bit in terms of a little bit of history, we set ethnicity targets along with our gender targets in 2014, and we've been working quite hard since then to meet those targets, and we've had various actions along the way. But that was really grounded in thinking of the present and also thinking of how we could improve things for the future. And I think recent events threw for all of us into sharp relief that actually in order to move forward, we also had to acknowledge the past. So we had to acknowledge the past and we had to apologize for the past. Because the past is actually part of resetting our agenda. It is actually part of that apology. So I think it was very important that we issued that statement. And in fact, we're going further internally by doing a review to understand what these connections were of our former governors and directors. We're removing any artifacts, paintings, etc., connected with them. And we're also looking a bit deeper into the indirect links that the Bank of England as an institution may have had with the slave trade. Albeit a long time ago, but it's very much resetting and looking forward, acknowledging the past.
But is it fair to say that the timing was stemming from the events of the summer after George Floyd's death here in the U.S. sparked global protests? Was that timing not factored into your decision?
Absolutely it was. I think that is what threw into sharp relief for us, that actually all our efforts in terms of trying to improve and move forward, in order to do that, we had to reset the past. And I think that helps us understand that we had to reset the past. We have a very strong BAME network, our staff network in the bank, and we worked closely with them with this. And indeed, we're working closely with them with the review as well. And they work very closely with us in terms of all the actions we take to improve our processes, but importantly, improve our outcomes in this area.
The decision to remove artifacts and take down portraits of governors You know, one argument from places like museums, such as the V&A, is to keep up those displays and keep those artifacts up. But what you do is you say alongside that, you explain the truth about that past alongside those artifacts so that people understand the past. Was there any such discussion prior to your decision to remove those artifacts or portraits?
Absolutely. And in fact, we have got a museum attached to the Bank of England. So some of these artifacts were in actually the main building of the bank. And what we want to do, and again, working with our staff network, is to consider whether we should put some of those in the museum and whether it would be appropriate. But it has to be part of the narrative. It has to be part of the apology. It's acknowledging and apologizing for our past. So we're not ignoring it, but we are apologizing for it. And therefore, we're working with our staff network to see whether, when the museum is open, and of course it's closed at the moment, but when it reopens, whether it would be appropriate to have a display using those artifacts.
Right. The removal of these items begs a more existential question. Are apologies in these, moves to take down items attached to this period enough? Or does the bank believe that reparations should be looked at as part of the discussion?
Well, in terms of working with our staff network, we strongly feel that as well as acknowledging the past, we have to make the future better for our future employees. And that's diversity across the board. But we're working very closely with our BAME network to see how we can improve things. So, for example, we have about just over 4,000 staff. 20% are BAME staff or declare BAME, so that's quite a large figure. And we're proud of that. We're very proud of meeting our gender target below senior management at the beginning of 2020. But we're going to work with them to see how we can take things forward. So it's not just an apology of the past and then we can draw a line, not at all. It helps us move forward, and we've recently announced that our board will lead a review into what else we can do for our Black and minority ethnic colleagues. And I think that's really critical. So it isn't just a review of what to do with artifacts. It's actually very much grounding it in the present day and what more can we do. Because to be quite frank, we have set ourselves targets not only for below senior manager, but at senior management. The at senior management targets are challenging. We've had lots of outcomes, but they haven't resulted, lots of actions, but they haven't resulted in the outcomes that we really want. And therefore, we want to take a more forensic view of what more actions can we do? What more can we learn from other companies in order to really move the dial in this space?
Right. So it sounds like the review is more looking forward and about things you can do going forward for your Black, Asian, and ethnic minority talent versus having reparations of any sort to account for the past, if I understand you correctly.
Well, actually, there's two reviews, because there's the review into the past to really understand these links that our governors and directors may have had, and also that the Bank of England as a company may have had, in terms of, what did the bank as a company facilitate in terms of the City of London's role in slavery? What were the links between slavery and macroeconomic development? And once we have done that review, we'll be in a better place to understand what acknowledgement, what apology I think we need to make. But you're right, we didn't think it was enough simply to remove the artifacts. We wanted to dig a bit deeper and understand what were the links, what were we as an institution responsible for.
And what's the timeline for the review?
That's a good question. We haven't got a specific timeline, but we hope to finish it before Christmas. It really depends on the other work related to COVID, but we're not dragging our feet in this. That's for the backward-looking review. The forward-looking review we've announced internally to the bank, and we've said it probably will be about 6 months. We want to make sure we get this right.
Before we move on to questions about the bank itself and the targets, as you mentioned, I want to just ask one more thing on this point. It was very notable in the apology that the bank said it was itself never directly involved in slave trade. And I wondered, why make the point about no direct ties, given the bank by default had a role of extending credit during a time when such funding could be used to support slave trade?
Well, I think when we put that statement out, and it may be that the review tells us something different, but we have said that we want to do the review. But when we put that statement out, there's a lot of histories written about the Bank of England, and none of them have suggested that we've had any direct links. But we have acknowledged that some of our governors and directors had links, which is a very personal thing for them. But also as an institution, we want to dig a bit deeper to see, as you say, what role we had in facilitating the City of London's role. Now, whether that turns out to be more direct than histories of the Bank of England have indicated, that's what we want to find out.
Okay. So let's talk a little bit about the Bank of England's own targets. As I understand, you're aiming for 50% of employees below senior management to be female by year end, and 35% of senior management to be female in that same time frame. Will you meet those targets this year?
So I think it's very unlikely. And I think over the last year, our attrition levels have fallen significantly. So obviously we're doing less hiring. On the senior management targets, when we set them, our senior management was 17% female. That was back in 2013, and it's now 31%. So obviously we've made a lot of progress, and we acknowledge that we may not make the 35%. And our under senior management is approximately 46, 47%. So we may not meet the targets, and it's always a challenge to know whether to set a realistic and achievable target so you can celebrate meeting it, or to set yourself a much more challenging target so the outcome is actually better, even though you have to say, well, actually, we haven't met the stretch target. And we chose back in 2014 to set ourselves 35%. We knew it was a stretch, but we knew that it would really hold our feet to the fire, and that we would look at all the initiatives that we could possibly do to get there, which I feel that we've done. But the simple answer to your question, I think, is it's unlikely that we'll meet the targets. But I do believe that the outcomes will be significantly better than if we'd have set ourselves a slightly softer target.
I wondered if you could expand on a little bit, because one of my questions about the momentum in the face of Brexit, the pandemic, economies, is there a risk that these events end up masking the urgency of racial and gender inequity, because everyone is so focused on navigating these big macro forces at home, and especially since, as I understand, the UK suspended mandatory gender pay gap reporting this year so that businesses were so busy with other issues?
So, I mean, I think it's a good question to ask. I think that what the crisis has shown us in the Bank of England, and I can only speak for the Bank of England really, is that it's shown us how important diversity is. So we have had this economic shock. We've had to think about our policy in a different way. We've had to think about our operations in a different way. We've had to respond to that shock. We've had to think about our own ways of working in a different way, something that we never expected to be doing in 2020. And what it's taught us is that having a diverse workforce has really helped us to look at all those things through different lenses. So we're not just looking at it through one lens of, oh, we've always done it this way, because we've had to change what we're doing. In terms of our ways of working, we've involved our staff networks. How can we work from home or come back from the office? How can we be more inclusive in meetings when it's on video or on audio, et cetera, et cetera. And actually, it's been fantastic having all these different points of view, because you inevitably get to a better solution. So whether that's to do with economic policy, or whether it's to do with, having a meeting where half of the people are in the office and half of the people at home, and how do you manage to do that? You've got all these different points of view. So it's made us be more innovative. I actually think it's made us realize even more the importance of diversity. And we've actually coincided the the start of this pandemic, or the start of it in the UK, with having a new governor. So he also wanted to look at culture and about diversity and about inclusion. So we've had these two big forces which have really pushed us into, yes, this is even more important. And of course, there have been some opportunities in terms of inclusion. You know, you're no longer tied to how many chairs are there in a meeting room and how many people can get in. And we've managed to have conversations, albeit video and audio, with lots and lots of different people, which has been tremendously valuable when we're looking at ways of doing things differently. I think the big challenge for us is, one of the big challenges is our attrition at the moment has gone down, as you might expect. So if we want to constantly increase our the diversity of our workload, that just gives us a bit more of a challenge. But it gives us a fantastic opportunity, I think, of doing things differently and hearing different voices around the table.
So is the attrition the reason why you think you might miss your gender targets this year?
Well, it's certainly a contributing factor. Our attrition's been a lot lower since March this year. Now, I can't say we would have definitely met them. If not, you know, we were at 31% in March, and we're still at 31% female, and we have to get to 35%. It still would have been a stretch, but it's a contributing factor. There's no question to that.
Right. I wanted to ask just very quickly about your targets, because I asked you about gender, but I didn't ask about Black, Asian, and minority ethnic targets at the bank, commonly referred to as BAME in the UK.
Yeah.
But if I understand, your targets are 20% for that group of staff below senior management and 13% of senior management to be BAME by the end of 2022. Again, do you feel like you're on track still, or is that also unclear?
Okay, so in terms of our below senior management, our target is 20% by the end of 2020, and we've already met that. But in terms of senior management, we set the target at 13% by end 2022, and we're at 7%. So we've increased from, it was 2% when we set the target, and we're now at 7%. It's a stretch, there's no question about that. We will do everything we can to meet that target, but I think it's going to be challenging. But we haven't tried to change the target. We are still aiming for that.
Right. One of the things, you know, before the death of George Floyd and the protest, so much of the conversation around diversity was so gender focused. And some executives, you know, even now say that gender just feels like a safer issue to tackle than race. Has that been your experience?
Yeah, it's interesting you say that. I think that's possibly true for us. A number of our initiatives were intersectional. So things like mentoring and sponsorship. We have a returners program where we bring people back in. We have unconscious bias training. But actually, to answer your question, about a year ago, we started talking with our networks about exactly that. Is it because people feel awkward in this space? So we introduced these workshops called Let's Talk About Race. And they've been fantastic because people have talked openly